The Ostler's Daughter. Written and read by Christopher Halton. In upper-class Regency society, marrying below one's social group was considered une mésalliance impardonnable, and in polite company it would render one a social outcast, effectively leading to being ostracized by one's peer group. Living in an age where assumed class had strict demarcation lines certainly created problems for Sir Fosdyke Ambergris and his affections for Maria, a stunningly beautiful and elegant woman, the daughter of John Henson, a former ostler. Sir Fosdyke, a staunch and respected member of the landed gentry, with a familial ancestry dating back before the Norman invasion, had struggled to keep his feelings for Maria to himself. Conversely, it was the same for Maria, for whom the feeling was mutual. Still, as a personal maid to Lady Ambergris, Fosdyke's ailing mother, she was able to discreetly meet him within the Ambergris family home at Mardyke Hall, a fine Queen Anne pile built of stone and red brick, which rested on 1,000 acres of fine Oxfordshire countryside and an estate that was especially noted for its stud of fine racing horses. Maria, with her slim, fine frame, long blonde hair, and blue eyes, had a certain air of deportment that set her apart from women of her humble background. She was also very intelligent and well-read, having been taught to read and write by the local vicar, who ran a small classroom for bright children from poor families. In fact, with her beauty and humility, she had all the airs of a lady, and it was said that she was quite ambitious to elevate herself from her social class. However, nobody knew of her secret liaisons with the squire, a man in his early 30s, with her, a commoner woman in her mid-20s, and such was the state of play, for their secret dalliances and entreaties. Sir Fosdyke was in many ways different to Maria. He was a quiet, unassuming, well-spoken and privately educated man with no personal interest in the social set of the period. For him, Maria would be his soulmate, making him finally complete in his life. His wealth afforded many privileges which enabled him to sit in a higher social tier than those of his contemporaries, with the exception, perhaps, of his widowed mother, who would suffer an apoplexy if she knew of her son's interest with Maria. And so the charade continued for a few years before Lady Ambergris died in her bed of old age. Following the funeral, which was attended by the great and the good, Lady Ambergris was finally laid to rest in the family crypt, and it was after a respectable period of mourning that Maria made her first move to assure herself a place at Fosdyke's side by entreating him to make her the governess of the house. This would allow her unrestricted access to Sir Fosdyke and to engage on a semi-social level, at least with his peers who frequently visited. He willingly agreed to such a proposition, and an apartment was made available to her not too far from Fosdyke's bedroom on the first floor of this sprawling house. As part of her employment, a maidservant was made available to her, and she ate at breakfast, lunch and dinner with Fosdyke in the great hall. Of course, in time, the servants' tongues would waggle, and rumour and innuendo were rife. Maria seemed to harden as a woman as she grew into her new role and improved her social status, and she was known to be a strict disciplinarian with the staff under her supervision. This state of affairs culminated to a head when Maria appeared to fall pregnant, and soon it was commonplace to suggest that Fosdyke was the father. And one day it happened. Maria disappeared. Fosdyke explained she had left to take up a new position as a governess in India, and forbade any further conversation on the subject. And so the years passed, and Fosdyke, never marrying, died as a bachelor in 1875, and nothing was ever heard from Maria again. His solicitors disposed of his estate to various good causes, as there was no heir, and the house itself ended up in the hands of a wealthy London-based businessman, John Clark, who acquired the property with stables and a few hundred acres for leisure purposes. Clark, a man in his mid-60s, was short, somewhat rotund, and always dressed immaculately for whatever occasion when seen around the neighbourhood. He had a fondness for cigars and fine wines, and, like Fosdyke, was unmarried. He rarely socialised locally, but was always polite and acted the perfect gentleman accordingly. Apart from a small retinue of staff, he was known to keep to himself and mind his own business, although he would occasionally entertain guests who arrived for weekends from London. And it is here that I, Henry Upton, a friend and colleague of John Clarke, step into this story. John wrote to me in August 1882 and implored me to visit. Knowing that he was a rare but generous host to visitors, I snapped at the opportunity. I travelled by train to Ambergris railway halt in Oxon, where I was greeted by a servant, Mr. Foster, driving a spring brougham drawn by a beautiful black hackney, whom he affectionately called Timbers. Quite why and how the odd appellation was given for a horse's name was never explained. But Foster was a congenial chap in his mid-50s and was slim and sprightly. With a smile he took my portmanteau and said in a cheery Cockney accent, "Let me take this, governor. Mr. Clarke tells me to ensure I'll get you to the house safely, and I brought the brougham for a bit of comfort for you, sir." He doffed his bowler, and after loading the portmanteau securely in the coach-box boot, he opened the passenger door. After alighting, he closed it securely and set off towards the estate along leafy, narrow Oxon country lanes before eventually arriving at Mardyke Hall, where another servant took my luggage and escorted me into the library, where I was warmly greeted by John, who was chomping on a cigar butt while holding a hefty tome taken from the mahogany veneered bookshelves. Putting down the book on a reading table and leaving the rather chewed butt in a ceramic ashtray, he shook my hand and beckoned me to sit with him. After doing so, he poured a glass of port for us and said, "Jolly well pleased to see a friendly face here, Henry. Haven't been back to the city for a while, and to be perfectly frank, I'm suffering cabin fever, what?" I looked around the spacious room, which featured beautifully executed plaster cornices framing 10 bookshelves that lined and intersected the room. I stared through a beautiful Queen Anne upper sash window onto a beautifully manicured lawn surrounded by flower beds, and said, "Well, John, if this is cabin fever, I'm more than happy to share this with you." He gave a deep belly laugh. "Oh, you know perfectly what I mean, old boy. I never get the chance to get out and about. There's always something to do here, my friend, and rarely an opportunity to entertain. So you can imagine how jolly well pleased I am, old bean." Knowing that with Clarke nothing is ever as it appears on the surface, I inquired, "Well, John, your letter to me seemed rather urgent. Is there something here that I may help you with?" His smile briefly dropped from his weather-beaten face, and scratching an impressive black handlebar moustache, he replied in a more subtle tone, "Well, how does one put this? There have been some rather odd things occurring about the place, and while I can't put my finger on bally who or why, I believe the house is haunted." He paused. "I know you may think I have lost my senses, but it is true." I was temporarily shocked and replied, "And what exactly do you define as haunted, dear friend?" He took a swig of port, and having refilled both our glasses and lit a cigar, he continued, "When I took over this house, I renovated it from top to bottom. It cost me an absolute fortune, but still, if you want the best, you have to spend money. For a few months after moving in, it was quiet and rather peaceful. But then, on some nights..." He paused and looked about himself and continued, "Some nights odd things happen. At first I put it down to age and imagination, but it grew stronger and..." I interjected, "Can we get to the point?" "Well, I have, I think, seen a woman dressed in turn-of-the-century clothing floating down the passages and corridors on the ground and first floor. She was at first a grey, almost ethereal mist that gradually grew form, and as she became clearer and more solid, I could see that she was looking into rooms as she passed doorways, and she had the look of urgency about her. I can tell you that at first I was mildly shocked, but my concerns are deepening as she becomes more real than ghostly. On occasions she even opens doors, and one time she stopped on the first-floor passageway and just stood and stared at me as she then faded away." "What about your staff?" "Well," he responded, "that is the strangest thing. None have seen her, although they have reported doors opening on their own, and sometimes the sound of feet walking down the corridors and passageways throughout the house, but nothing other than that." "Have you done any research on the history of the house?" Well, yes, I spoke to the local vicar, a nice chap called Betts, and he told me that many years ago a governess here called Maria left the estate to take up employment in India. The rumours were that she was made pregnant by the then squire, a chap called Sir Fosdyke Ambergris, and he didn't do the decent thing, but instead threw her out. So that is the only historical drama here, and I'm dashed to understand what this is all about, to be honest. Before you arrived, who lived here? Up until 1875, it was still this chap Ambergris, who died a bachelor in his 80s. But according to a private investigator I hired, he, having spoken to former staff, discovered that all was fine here until he passed away. And then they claim they heard all the incidents I related to you, which is not the answer I was expecting, as I assumed this had been going on many years. I sat quietly, mulling this over to myself, and said, "So why am I here?" "I heard from some chap that you had an interest in all this sort of thing, having attended a few séance sittings in London, and being a level-headed ex-army officer, I thought all of this would be right up your street, as it were." I smiled. "Yes, I have attended a few in company with a lady friend who believes in this, but to be perfectly honest, I think this is the stuff of nonsense, and in the case of séances, a perfect sham. You know, a sharp practice perpetrated on naive folk for money. But I don't think you have imagined or made this up, so I'm rather oddly perhaps inclined to believe you. By arrangement with my host, I was housed during my tenure in the former bedroom of Sir Fosdyke, a spacious and almost palatial room with large windows that offered a wonderful view across the rear gardens. The walls were decorated with fine landscape oils and watercolours, and the room was furnished with large mahogany wardrobes, a four-poster double bed, a day table featuring a Georgian wicker-seated chair, and rich deep-pile carpets on the floor. And, as with the rest of the property, it had gas lighting which significantly brightened the room. I also omit to mention a luxurious ensuite toilet and bathroom. To say the very least, I felt well accommodated, and even had maid service in the morning to bring me breakfast and the daily newspapers. The first night passed without incident, although John insisted he had heard footsteps during the small hours. However, even he had to admit that the house remained relatively quiet. The following day I decided to wander around the property to ascertain for myself whether any of the sound anomalies could be explained. But of course my inquiries drew an anticipated blank. However, there was one place not mentioned to me, which was the cellar, which ran the entire width and breadth of the house. Taking a lit oil lamp, I was escorted into the basement area by the servant Foster, who remarked nervously upon entry down a flight of steps, "Nobody ever goes in here, sir, downright creepy if you ask me," as he held the lamp aloft nervously to peer into the darkness. The cellar was brick-lined with flagstone flooring. It was used as a storage area, but showed little signs of recent activity, having been decorated with a multitude of dusty old spider webs. Still, one spot suggested that there had been past activity since the house was built, and that was a walled-off section to the side wall of the cellar, which indicated some building work since the house was erected, as the original walls were made of red soft brick. The more recent work was built from fired clay bricks. I commented on this to Foster, who remarked, "Search me, sir, never really noticed this before, as it is far from the door in here. And I can tell you, if I goes in here, it isn't for too long, or as too far from the door as is necessary." One thing, though, did strike me as odd. It had a heavy, pervasive atmosphere, and I felt that there was someone or something in residence, and that sensation was palpable. However, I attributed these feelings to my nerves. It was very creepy, and after a short time we returned to the ground floor. I spent the afternoon researching in the library. Despite the many volumes of books inherited by John on his acquisition of the property, I could find nothing of interest that would assist me. The only way I could get to the bottom of this was to wait, watch and listen. After an enjoyable evening dinner with my host, we retired to the drawing room, where we relaxed over a few drinks while John probed me about my investigations. Of course, the only point of interest was in the cellar, and I explained the palpable feeling of dread, and the fact that it felt strongly of a presence. But of course, the only tangible element was the wall, which looked either rebuilt or worse, as I imagined, it sealed in a portion of the cellar from public gaze. Well, old boy, I can't help you there very much. It was already there when I took over. I surmised it was a repair, but I have no documentation as such that explains this. He then smiled and leaned over his club chair to pick up a worn leather-bound ledger-type book. Passing it to me, he said, "Found this, though, Henry, in one of the cupboards in the kitchen. It is a daily record maintained by the former governess here, Maria Henson, who, as you may not know, was the lady who went to India. What I find particularly interesting is the absence of an entry stating the termination of employment, as one might expect. It concludes with a single dated entry, Thursday, the 25th of October 1821, and all that was shown were the daily duties and expenses, and yet previous entries show no events of significance. Curious, I looked and confirmed his observations, but as there were many previous entries in copperplate handwriting, he agreed to let me have the book to assist my research. Later that night, I sat at my desk in my bedroom under the pulsating glow of the gas light. I noted that the records began in 1817, and over the course of 4 years, they provided a fascinating insight into the operation of a country house from Maria Henson's perspective. The records were meticulous, covering all aspects of expenses and duties, as well as the engagement and termination of staff. They were devoid of any personal opinion and remained purely factual, but there was no record of any building work in the cellar, which would account for what I observed, which, if asked, I would have suggested by their condition to have been during her tenure. But having enjoyed a large meal with plenty of wine, I fell asleep while sitting at my desk. During the night I had a remarkably clear and vivid dream, in which I saw, under the brightness of candlelight, a beautiful blonde-haired woman in a Regency-era dress having a violent argument with an immaculately dressed gentleman of the period. He was wearing formal evening attire consisting of a black tailcoat with the back elegantly cut away and the front tapering to a sharp waistline. Beneath it I saw an ivory-coloured silk waistcoat. His cravat was of crisp whiteness gleaming against the dark coat, and he wore tight-fitting knee breeches of fine buckskin, ending at the knee with fine, polished Hessian boots. At his waist he wore a small gold watch on a chain. His dark, slightly receding hair was brushed forward, and I smelt a faint dab of cologne about him. He was a fine-looking man in his 30s. In contrast, the woman was wearing a silk celadon green gown, with a waistline cut just below the bust, which accentuated a graceful columnar silhouette, with the skirt flowing in airy folds to the floor. She had short puffed sleeves edged with fine lace. Her neckline was low and wide, revealing her shoulders. Around her neck she wore a delicate necklace, and on her arms long evening gloves of soft kid leather. Her hair was dressed in intricate curls, braids and loops, adorned with jewelled combs. She was indeed a beautiful, almost classical-looking woman in her mid to late 20s. At first I assumed they were a married couple, but I somehow knew that these two were Sir Fosdyke Ambergris and Maria Henson. She was in tears and pleading with him when she suddenly struck out and slapped his face with her right hand. He, nursing the slap, pushed her, and she slipped and fell back with her head hitting the corner of a bedside table, and she fell still on the floor, bleeding profusely from a head wound. I could see that the scene was the bedroom I was in, and the large windows were open, with a storm raging outside. The curtains fluttered back and forth almost in panic, revealing the scene on the floor below from flashes of lightning from a gathering storm, while the candles, like Maria, were snuffed out. It was a terrible scene, and in realization of what he had done, he fell to the floor, clutching his head with both hands and wailing inconsolably. And then, in panic, I felt the visage finally play out before me, forcing me to consciousness, where I saw reassuringly that the room was still and the windows closed, with the gas light still flickering on the walls. It was a dream, but a terrible and prophetic one. I could not sleep well for the remainder of the night, and felt sure that footsteps crept around my bed in the shadows. Something with some impatience was urging me to do something, and to do something soon. The next morning I was awakened from my sleep by my maid serving me breakfast in bed. She could see, I was sure, that I was in a debilitated state, with heavy shadowing beneath my eyes, and my hair unkempt and scruffy. She placed the tray down, leaned over me, and said, as I lay still with fearful shock, "Are you all right, sir? Have you had a bad night's sleep? I can return later if you wish." I sat up in bed, rubbing my eyes, and quickly regained control of my senses to respond, "No, that is okay. I'll be fine. And yes, you are perfectly correct. I had a terrible night." She turned to leave and said in parting with a smile, "I understand, sir. I will leave you to enjoy your breakfast in peace." With that, she opened and closed it quietly as she left. I felt such a fool. But in truth, this was the most realistically awful dream I have ever suffered, and its consequences lingered with me for hours. Having bathed and dressed, I went downstairs and saw John, who was busy with the staff working outside in the stables. At my suggestion, he walked with me into the grounds, where we sat together by a water feature in the rear gardens. I shared my dream with him, and he sat silently, shocked as I relayed a detailed description of the woman to him. "'Pon my soul, that is the woman I have seen in the house. Your description is absolutely on the button, old bean. What a rum deal, eh, to have to suffer a dream like that. What do you suggest we do?" My thoughts on the matter centred on the cellar wall. I started to believe more convinced that there was a connection between Maria's disappearance and its construction, and I shared that with him. He sat there, lit a cigar, and stared almost blindly across the grounds, and after a few seconds of thought he said, "I'll get a local surveyor chap I know to check the wall out. If it isn't a load-bearing and put there to support the foundations, we'll jolly well have a hole knocked through into it to see what lies beyond." He forced a brief smile, adding, "Hopefully we'll put this mystery once and for all to rest." We returned later to the house after sitting and discussing the day, and he went off to ask one of the servants to take a gig into a neighbouring village to request the surveyor, a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Atkins, to attend the following day to examine the property. That night I decided to eat dinner alone in my room, as I didn't want my generous host to ply me with alcohol, which was his wont. I eventually turned in around 11 p.m, having read a book, and quickly fell into sleep. It was probably around 1 a.m, although I couldn't be sure, that I woke to the sound of a man sobbing. I left one of the gas lights on prior to sleeping, and nervously scanned my eyes around the room. At first I saw nothing, but then I heard footsteps walking around the room, which sounded rather heavy, as if they belonged to a man. And then a mist started to form at the foot of my bed. It was rather light to begin with, but became thicker and heavier, and at the same time the atmosphere became heavier and much more intense. I then heard a man's voice, which whispered in a strange, detached, echoey form, "Maria, oh my darling Maria, what have I done to you, my love? What have I done?" The voice was sad and rather doleful, interspersed with more crying that was deep and resonating. It was then that the mist parted, and I saw with perfect clarity the man I had witnessed in my dream. This time he was bending down and pulling at something heavy on the floor towards the door. This went on for a few minutes as I saw the door open, and he disappeared through it while still pulling at something below. There was a sudden flash of light in the room, followed by complete darkness, as even the gas wall light was extinguished. I immediately left my bed and relit the light, but everything was as I had left it earlier. A cold chill reverberated down my spine, and the unmistakable horror that this was a manifestation of Ambergris, removing Maria from the room. I realized that it was more than likely that Ambergris had put Maria's body in the walled-off section of the cellar. Still, as I agreed with John's opinion that it was best to allow any breaching decision to the surveyor, I managed that night to return to sleep with a sleeping draught. The next day in the afternoon, the surveyor, Mr. Atkins, arrived at the house. Escorted by John and myself, we took him into the cellar, where, under the lamplight, he inspected the wall and decided it wasn't load-bearing and was safe to be demolished. Shortly after leaving, a team of workmen was assembled from the staff, and with the aid of sledgehammers and pickaxes, the wall was punctured and carefully demolished. Sat in an old horsehair-stuffed chair was the remains of what appeared to be the skeleton of a woman who still had tresses of blonde hair and was wearing the remnants of the dress I had seen in my dream. It was a shocking sight to see, and John himself was so overcome with shock that he had to be carried out into the courtyard to be revived. A local doctor was summoned, as was the police, and following an examination of the corpse in situ, it was discovered that she had suffered head trauma, following either being struck or from a fall. A note was made of her clothing, and the police and the doctor agreed she died well over 50 years ago, which was confirmed later at a coroner's court. It was also decided that she died following a fall, and that Ambergris had likely concealed her body. Therefore, no further inquiries or action could be made by the police, and the matter was closed. But in closing, the most wonderful thing happened on the night of her body's discovery. Both John and I had finished dinner, and we made our way to the drawing room to enjoy some glasses of port together. As we entered the hallway to cross into the drawing room on the other side, we both saw, as in life, Fosdyke and Maria, resplendent in their Regency dress, walking arm in arm to the main entrance, before stopping briefly to turn and smile at us, before disappearing forever through the closed door. They were both still plainly in love with each other, and were finally reunited in death. Maria no longer had to haunt the corridors in search of her lost love, and he no longer needed to feel guilty for a terrible accident that had happened so many years earlier. As there were no living relatives, it was decided that she would be interred in the Ambergris family crypt, where both would lie together for an eternity, bound to each other in love and respect. The End. The Lighthouse. Written and read by Christopher Halton. Living alone on the windswept coast of Norfolk, my main activity for relaxation and enjoyment has always been walking my dog Rex along the dunes that gather along the shore at Wareham. During the summer, the beach is alive with tourists arriving from charabanc horse-drawn coaches to estate workers from the neighbouring area. Children play in the shallow surf, whilst families sun themselves or share a picnic on the sands and beach. The daily cycle completes when all has gone and nature tentatively returns, with the shrill sound of seagulls scavenging the remains of discarded food waste, and the occasional seals make a cautious presence in the waters near the shore. This pattern of life continues until the end of the warm summer months, when the hastening chill of winter returns, with the autumnal embrace of late September. Then the sun gives way to cloudy, dark and brooding skies, followed by quickening breezes that blow with a contemptuous ease the dry sand into inconsistent drifts that sweep the sea and shore. Driven by these winds, the ocean swells into tall lines of rolling surf that resemble a stampede of angry white horses breaking into a gallop before crashing thunderously to the shore and disappearing until the next wave, leaving in their wake a crisp, smooth, wet sand that occasionally glistens incandescently from a ray of sunlight breaking through the clouds that leaves an infused ray of summer colour that brightens the heavy, sombre greyness. In scenes like this, I have always felt a deeper connection to nature, and all the impurities of my humanity are swept from within like a refreshing spa of cleansing water. During these colder months, I seldom encounter another person. I find enjoyment and fulfillment living in splendid isolation from the bustling world of the nearby villages. These places of habitation are protected from the windy coast by ranks of swaying fir trees that stand like sentinels across the flat landscape. The tranquility of this wild setting is a peaceful respite from the noise and chaos of the human world. Occasionally, this sombre disconsolation is lifted by the presence of another beach walker, who too, I suspect, is finding his own path in the meandering walkways of life. but other than an acknowledging wave from a walking stick, we pass without comment as the wind drowns any attempt at a polite conversation. That shroud of silent speech completed a sense of remoteness in this forlorn, wayward place. And what of my life in nature's grand scheme of things? I am but a small part of it, a humble observer of its beauty and power. My connection to nature is a bond that brings me solace and understanding of life's challenges. My home, such as it is a small whitewashed three-roomed cottage with a thatched roof and a small garden that backs onto a landscaped country estate filled with sheep and cattle in pasture. It lies at the end of a rutted track and is far removed from the annoyances of neighbours. The beauty of the cottage and its surroundings never fails to fill me with a sense of awe and appreciation for the natural world. I came here over 30 years ago after losing my dear wife Imelda, who succumbed to a heart attack when she was barely 20 years old. She was the rock of my life, and my heart was anchored so firmly to hers that her passing left me bereft and unable to reconcile myself to a world that selflessly moves on, leaving those who have passed into fading memories that are soon forgotten. My sole companion is Rex, a mixed-breed stray who perchance I discovered 5 years ago, shivering and forlorn at my doorstep. He was a pitiful sight to behold. He was starving and drenched from the rain and repeatedly howled for help with an anguished cry. Since that sad day, he has been my loyal friend and always by my side, his presence a comforting balm to my wounded heart. Just as I sought my own solace, I could sense that Rex also bore the scars of sorrow, but his pain stems from the sting of rejection rather than the loss of a cherished loved one. This unspoken understanding came to me when I first gazed into his soulful, round brown eyes, revealing a deep emotion that never lies, and reinforcing an unbounded friendship of love, trust and honour that was now unbreakable. One very windy morning in April 1896, I, accompanied by my faithful friend, went for a bracing walk along the beach. It was very stormy, with giant waves that rose to 15 feet in height before hitting the beach and rolling into the dunes some 20-odd feet from the sea ingress. It seemed that at some point these waves, driven by a furious wind, would breach the granite line of rubble that served as a sea wall, and so to err to the side of caution, we kept well within this line of rock to ensure that neither of us was swept out to sea. Going out was perhaps a rather foolhardy decision. Still, neither of us could bear being kept the whole day within my little cottage's plastered brick walls, and regardless of the weather, walking always gave us a sense of enjoyment through the freedom that the seascape offered. Watching the foment of a wild, wind-driven, rampaging sea and fast-sweeping grey clouds was a sight to behold. I have to admit, however, that this fast-moving wind was almost impossible to walk against, but with our heads down, we pressed forward, determined to reach the old lighthouse, which, being set high on the dunes, would afford us some shelter to stand and admire the sheer ferocity of Mother Nature. As we drew closer, the wind strengthened and was accompanied now by freezing driving rain, which created a misty spray on contact with the seaward side of this stone tower. The lighthouse stood almost heroically steadfast against the savagery of nature as the driving rain hurled itself against it. By now I realized that we could not return safely to the cottage, and I decided to seek shelter until the storm passed within its walls. My only hope was that the lighthouse keeper would hear us if the door were locked. Carrying Rex in my arms, we reached the door, which was more like a large steel hatchway. I pushed the lever door handle down, and the door opened inwards. We both entered the tower, which had a small stone room attached to its landward side. Here the atmosphere was much quieter. The whistling, relentless wind, although gathering apace, was less apparent. Sitting by a lit wood burner was an older, grey-bearded man, rubbing his hands against the stove heat as he clenched an unlit clay pipe in his mouth. He turned in surprise and said, "You ought not to be out here on a day like this, but you are welcome to stay." I put Rex down, but the dog seemed hesitant to stand near the man who was wearing a rolled-neck grey woolen sweater and a small blue fisherman hat. He beckoned me to sit next to him and told me that his name was Tom Roberts and that he had worked maintaining the light on the tower for the better part of 40 years. His face, etched with years of experience, had a weather-beaten look, with warm, twinkling blue eyes. Feeling more relaxed with our presence, he lit the pipe and inhaled rough, cut-smelling tobacco before removing the pipe and saying, "You live yonder down the track near the Wainwright estate, don't you?" I replied that I did, but I admitted that I never recall having seen this gentleman in all my years there. "Aye," he replied, "I have seen you around. You get to know your neighbours." He turned back towards the fire, staring intently at the flickering flames through the open fuel door. He didn't speak a great deal, and, like myself, was obviously a man who preferred his own company. "Why do you live alone in that small cottage?" he asked. Under the circumstances, I thought he was highly personal, as I had just met him. "Well, if you must know, it is simply that I choose to do so," I replied indignantly. He smiled and said, "We all have our reasons, sometimes through choice and sometimes because that is what fate has delegated to us." He paused to inhale more smoke from his pipe and continued, "You don't mind me saying so, but I feel it is because you love someone so dear to you, isn't it?" By now I was getting a little angry, but I kept a calm demeanour and replied, "Well, yes, I lost the only true love in my life many years ago, and even now it pains me so to speak of it." "I thought so," he said, stabbing the wood in the fire with a poker, "but I can tell you now, the ones we lost are always with us. It is just because your eyes are not opened wide enough to see them. But you will." I responded, "And you know, do you, Tom?" with a subtle hint of sarcasm. He looked at me directly and said, "Oh, yes, I do, and it was a young lady, wasn't it?" Now visibly shocked, I said, "How do you know so much? Are you some seer of past events?" He looked away and replied, "Yes, sadly I am, and it has always been so, but I can tell you that your missing love, Imelda, I think that is her name, will be reunited with you despite what you think has happened in your life." Shocked, I said, "I never mentioned her name, and you know this of me." "I know many things, my friend, and sometimes what you think is the life you have led is often an illusion, as I am sure you will see." Just then the howling and whistling wind abated, and Tom, upon seeing sunshine rise through a small window, said, "You can return safely now, and remember, life is not one path. You have choices." With that, he beckoned me to leave as he started ascending the spiral staircase to the top of the tower, and said in parting, "I had better check the light, but you must realize that you now have another path to tread if you choose to do so." With that, he was gone, so Rex and I, happier to be outside, made our way back along the sandy shore. The sea was much calmer now, and instead of a vicious wind, a gentle breeze replaced the horror of the last hour with the warmth from the sun. I gave much thought to my meeting with this strange man. When I thought about it, I realized that in all the years of living here, I had never met anyone, let alone Tom, working at the Lighthouse. This added even more confusion to my strange meeting on that unusually very stormy day. But admittedly, I never once bothered to venture to the Lighthouse, as I preferred being with my own company to being with others. The following day I awoke to a deathly quiet dawn. Outside, a thick and heavy fog encapsulated everything, clinging tenaciously to the cottage and everything around it. My vision was restricted to but a few feet, and the sheer intensity of its heaviness compelled even the birds in the neighbouring trees to remain silent. Like the previous day's storm, I had not met anything like it, and it added a sense of mystery to what lay in and around its heavy shroud. Rex unusually did not want to linger within it, and having done his business, he returned inside the cottage, not wanting to leave. In the stillness, I heard a faint female voice without clarity of speech. I did not know who it was, but I knew it was pretty near in this misty greyness. Thinking it was a walker in distress, I ventured away alone from the cottage in search of its owner. But I found nobody, and the voice gradually faded into silence, and so frustratingly I returned home. The same fog prevailed for the next few days, and its heaviness seemed much darker as it seemingly cut out any light from penetrating its ever-deepening mantle. In the far distance, the rotating beam of the lighthouse stoically remained, emitting what seemed to be a faint glow of light that barely punctuated this arid gloominess. Therefore, I decided to walk to the lighthouse to speak to Tom. Perhaps he could explain what was happening with this unfathomable weather front. After all, lighthouse keepers must receive weather reports to assist them with their work, and with Rex's reluctance to venture outside, I needed some company. Using the light as a guide, I carefully walked through the gloom, keeping landward as best as possible along a shingle path next to the granite boulders. Ahead of me I saw the faint outline of a female form wearing what looked to be a bodice and full-length flared dress. But even that was guesswork, as the figure was faint and almost ghost-like in the heavy, unrelenting fog. I called out, but she did not acknowledge me as she walked ahead and away towards the lighthouse, before quickly disappearing into the mist. After some minutes of walking like a blind man, I eventually arrived at the entrance to the lighthouse. The door was unlocked, and I tentatively entered. Before, I had sought shelter, and now I felt quite palpably that something less pleasant and ominous was in the air. The room was lit with oil lamps and a fire burned in the stove. I called for Tom, but he was nowhere to be found. It was then that I spotted a wooden plaque, which I had not seen before, affixed to the wall by the window. In beautiful hand-painted lettering, it read, "In memory of lighthouse keeper Tom Roberts, who died heroically trying to rescue a walker and his dog during the great storm of April 1896. Requies in Parcher." I stood visibly shocked and weak, so I sat by the fire in Tom's chair to recover from the shock. From here I again read the plaque, expecting I had misread the text, but it had not changed. I assumed this must have been referencing an act committed after we left, because I felt alive and grateful for the warmth the fire gave me, and I believed now that I had been the victim of a cruel joke. But who, I thought, would commit such a terrible thing? I clambered the iron steps to the top of the tower, and the gas lamps beamed bright light into the darkness from the convex reflecting plates, which silently rotated on a dais. But there was nobody to be found. I was terrified and very confused. Nothing made sense anymore. I felt lost and vulnerable. With a sullen heart, I returned downstairs. Tom, I was shocked to see, was now sitting by the fire, and this time there was no plaque on the wall. "Tom," I said excitedly, "what the hell is happening?" He looked up with a resigned face of certainty of fate and answered calmly, "We are all no longer alive, my friend. You and your dog were carried into the surf by a huge wave, and I was trying to save you with a rope I threw to you, but a second wave hit us unexpectedly, and we were all drawn out into deep water, where we drowned. None of our bodies have yet to be discovered, but they will eventually. And now we are in a void between the world of our past lives and this place, which exists as a state of limbo that can take us backwards and forwards into time, as we either remain here as spiritual entities or we choose to move on." He continued, "I knew of this when you came, and I also learned of Imelda because she was here waiting for you, but then it wasn't the right moment to meet. Now she waits for you and Rex outside to take you all into the light. She has waited for you for so many years, and soon, my friend, you will be reunited for an eternity." He smiled, and the door opened. Imelda stepped in, as beautiful and perfect as she had been when I last saw her so many years ago. She smiled, and her eyes radiated a warmth and a beauty that brought back the many sweet memories of our lives together. Those empty years of enforced solitude evaporated like steam from a kettle, so I felt once more a complete person. "Darling," she exclaimed, "I have wandered this earth as lonely as you, and have waited so patiently as I watched the sadness of your lonely years, which I too felt and experienced. But now we are together forever, and we shall never ever have to be apart." My memories flooded back as I felt her warm embrace, her kiss, and the sweet scent of her favourite perfume revitalizing my soul. Saying farewell to Tom, we walked arm in arm with Rex by our side, once more into the fog and a now forming chasm of light that opened before us as we stepped into it. On the other hand, Tom chose to remain, for even in death, the duties of a lighthouse keeper continued, despite so many years later, when the lights became automated and the last keeper had finally left. Today it is said that Tom has been sighted in the tower many times by walkers and maintains a watchful eye on the lights above. Those in the living world refuse to go near the tower at night for fear of meeting his spectre, who, it is said, is a kind, almost jovial spirit who will remain steadfastly on duty to the end of time. The End. The House of Shame, written and read by Christopher Halton. Salton Hall, a dilapidated 18th century clapboarded seafarer's house of 5 bedrooms, had stood alone, empty and unwanted for many years on the lower fringes of a Suffolk salt marsh. Once the proud home of a retired sea captain who died 20 years earlier, little local interest was shown in living in such a forlorn and remote location, which offered little shelter and respite from the salt-laden winds of the North Sea blowing in from beyond the crumbling seawall. The white-painted clapboard sheathing over old brick was worn and faded into grey, and the peeling painted sash windows were swollen with penetrating damp, cracking the small glass window panes, which were coated in dirt and dried salt. Its cobweb-covered rooms and dust-laden floors were but the residue of lingering memories, and the creaking of floorboards and doors were its voice. Relentlessly, the battering wind rapping against the windows with rain tapping the cracked glass created a haunting atmosphere. Lifeless eyes stare out in cautious fear of hidden secrets yet to be discovered from the gloomy depths within. Silently, thoughts of better days gone by drift into the tranquillity of abandonment, while the world beyond moves on unfettered from the past. Nestled next to a tidal creek, smugglers of old used the house to conceal their illicit contraband brought under cover of darkness to avoid the revenue men's unwanted intrusion by offshore boats armed with dry powdered cannon and muskets at the ready. In modern times, fishermen and wildfowlers claim that mysterious lights and muffled voices haunt the waters of the creek, accompanied by the sound of rowing boats gliding to the shore. And just occasionally this manifestation is preempted by a signalling lantern flash from within the old house before extinguishing back into darkness again. But that was the past, and in the present of 1926, the house struggled to find a buyer to breathe new life into its fading facade. That was until Giles Frobisher and his wife Amanda spotted the house from their offshore cruising cutter in June of that year as they berthed overnight just offshore. Giles, the 30-year-old son of a wealthy merchant banker, Sir Archibald Frobisher, and Amanda, the 25-year-old daughter of an American oil baron, were both young and affluent enough to be able to take on any financial challenge. Observing the house out at sea through a pair of binoculars, they could see a for sale board fixed to the property, which immediately piqued their interest. Intrigued, they arranged for the 4-man crew to row them ashore, where the rowing boat was pulled up from the water onto a compacted stone slipway, where they set foot to wander around the property, taking note of its parlous condition. They rubbed the dried salt from the window panes and peered through the semi-opaque glass, into the bare rooms within. Damp had penetrated the plastered walls, which were splashed with grey mould, and sections of the ceiling had collapsed, leaving the floor covered with chunks of plaster, which resembled discarded pieces of a wedding cake. It had a certain atmosphere, and not just of sadness, but of a circumspect presence that was all-seeing and all-knowing. It was plain to see that considerable renovation had to be done to make this derelict into a habitable home once more. However, considering its location and the safe anchorage available in the creek, which could easily accommodate their 40-foot cutter even at low tide, they decided to contact the solicitor to arrange a viewing. Having later returned to their home in Mayfair, London, they contacted Mr. Runcie of Smith, Arbour and Runcie's solicitors to attend and assess the property for purchase. Following a phone call to the practice in Aldborough, they arrived a week later at these offices, where they were welcomed by Mr. Runcie, the sole partner, in his well-appointed office. The office was well furnished and comfortable. Mr. Runcie, a distinguished gentleman in his 50s, greeted them warmly and professionally. Mr. Runcie, a man of medium build, immaculately dressed in a black pinstripe morning coat, grey waistcoat, grey trousers, and a wing-collared shirt with a black tie, invited the couple to sit in a pair of wing leather chairs, whilst his secretary made a pot of tea with a small milk jug, saucered cups and sugar, which she presently brought in on a tray before the business in hand concerning the house took place between them. Having made them comfortable, Mr. Runcie began. "The property has a great deal of potential, but as you have seen, and I make no bones about it, it does require a great deal of work. What is your interest in acquiring it, as I have some far better residencies I can offer you, which might be far more beneficial to your needs?" Giles chimed in. "Well, that house is top hole, as we are both a keen sailing couple, and the location being close to the sea with the deep water mooring nearby is absolutely spiffing. We appreciate that the amount of work needed is frightfully extensive, and last week I sent a surveyor to assess that aspect, so we realise it will be awfully costly." Mr. Runcie smiled in anticipation of a quick sale for a property he had never expected to sell, but he knew from inquiries with friends in London that the Frobishers could afford it. "I take it, therefore, that you both wish to carry out a viewing, and I am more than happy to loan you the house keys for a couple of days to ensure you are both fully aware of the internal state before completing any purchase." "Oh, absolutely, old chap," replied a visibly excited Giles, as he sipped tea from a Minton china cup with saucer. "We will drop the keys off later today, as we have to return to London tonight." Having ended their small talk, Mr. Runcie handed over a large bunch of old-fashioned keys, which were reminiscent of a jailer's than any modern house set, and he added, "Just drop them through the letterbox on the way back, and we can discuss the house later if you still wish to buy." "Jolly good show, Mr. Runcie," replied Giles in a peak of enthusiasm, and with that they got up, shook hands, and left. Within the hour the couple arrived at the house in their Bugatti sports car, and having parked on a trackway nearby, they made their way across some reeded marsh which swayed softly in a breeze, before arriving finally at the gravelled entrance, an imposing 18th century heavy oak-framed door with a shell cupola above, and a leaded semi-elliptical fan-shaped window beneath it. With some effort they partially prized open the door, and pushing hard against the stiffness of neglect, the door eventually swung open. Inside the hall they saw a series of doors on either side accessing the lounge, dining room, library and kitchen areas. Ahead was a wide-railed staircase. Broken arch pediments elegantly surmounted the internal door frames, and the panelled mahogany doors were fitted with high-quality brass knob handles with brass backplates. Both were intricately incised with scrolling patterns of flora and fauna, which added an air of classy informality to what otherwise was a run-down property with cracked ceilings, flaking paint, and thick layers of dust, which raked up a cloud of fine detritus when walking on it, and leaving in its wake heavy footmarks like footsteps in the snow. It was abundantly clear that no living human had set foot inside in many years. Amanda looked on in shock, mixed with excitement, and commented, "In so many ways, this house is what I want, but the work that needs to be done is rather daunting." Dusting his hands, Giles replied, "Yes, my dear, jolly well daunting indeed, but like you, I love the house." They explored the upstairs leading to the master bedroom, 3 guest rooms, and a staff room for servant accommodation, all in a parlous state, and of course there was no electricity, water or sewers, which had to be put in. As they were about to go downstairs, Amanda noticed from the landing window a woman walking past with a small child. Both appeared plainly dressed, but in the fleeting seconds she saw them, they had gone. Looking back at her husband, she said, "Giles, darling, we have visitors." Surprised, he replied, "Here? Who on earth could they be?" Curious, both walked down the stairs and went outside. There was nobody to be seen. "Are you sure about this, old bean?" he said as he shaded his eyes with his hand to scan the horizon from the blaring sun. Amanda agreed that she might have caught a glimpse of the bright light from the sun, and the figures could have been a reflection. They thought nothing more of it and continued to look around the house. There was something creepy in the atmosphere, but they attributed it to the house's current state and the damp, musty smell that pervaded its dank and dirty interior. Having completed this inspection, they went to the rear wall garden, which was overgrown and weed-filled, with buddleia bushes predominating in a competition with other shrubs for space. In the centre of this, and shaded from view by weed and shrub, was a lichen-covered stone stele of no more than 3 feet in height, which at first was assumed to be a grave. Giles pulled away the damp green shroud and discovered it was a memorial marker to the loss of the Prudence Usher, a brigantine passenger ship which broke up and sank offshore in February 1740 with the loss of 75 passengers and crew. How odd, Amanda, to place a memorial stone in the garden of this house. And I wonder where exactly this ship sank, and whether there were any survivors. Both agreed to make this a focal point in the restored garden. After finishing their inspection, they locked the property and returned to Aldborough to deposit the keys through Mr. Runce's office letterbox. Over the next few weeks, after a price was agreed upon and the property had been purchased in July, the Frobishers engaged numerous artisans and engineers through an agent to complete a full restoration of the property, which was scheduled to be completed by the following February. Cash was obviously not an issue for the Frobishers, and they expected the finished property to be of the highest standard, which also included a team of road engineers to complete a new road from the house and onto the mainland. All very ambitious, but nothing whatsoever was a problem. The agent in charge and overseeing the entire project was an architectural engineer from London, namely Robert Smithson, who rented a small cottage in Aldborough during the restoration. He was an ex-army major in the Royal Engineers, and as such, he had good management and engineering skills to ensure the work was completed on time. On site, Smithson had access to a prefabricated wooden office that was insulated against the elements. Inside, he had a desk, fire stove, lighting and telephone installed, and from here he provided daily updates to the Frobishers, who were very pleased with the work's progress. Work progressed well during July and August, with essential services such as electricity, water and sewerage connected. In mid-September, as the nights were starting to draw in, 2 builders working alone in the master bedroom suddenly collected up their tools and fled the house. Hearing the commotion, Smithson confronted the men as they prepared to go off-site. Having a large, burly, no-nonsense persona, Smithson was a difficult man for the builders to ignore. Confronting the 2 men with the narrowing eyes of a controlled rage, he bellowed at 2 simpering and terrified workers, "Where on earth do you think you are going?" One, a local man named Daniel Jacobs, replied fearfully, "I ain't staying a moment longer here, sir. The place is haunted, I tells you, haunted by a ghost. You ask my mate Marcus. He'll tell you that too." Having calmed both men down, they told him what had happened. Earlier in the afternoon, Smithson had instructed the men to remove some rotten floorboards for replacement the following morning by carpenters. It was a routine task and should not have taken half an hour. As they prized open one piece with the leverage of a crowbar, they discovered a small metal box of some vintage hidden in place between the flooring joists. Once they removed a second section next to it, they were about to lift it out to examine it, when Jacob saw a shadow of a cloaked man in a tricorn hat move across his legs, and a voice said, "There be my property you have, and I warn you to leave well alone." Both men clearly heard the disembodied voice, and in abject terror they grabbed their tools and fled. Smithson took the men back with him to the room and saw the metal box in situ inside a cavity next to a flooring joist. Lifting out the 6-inch long box, he noticed it was quite heavy with items rattling inside. Unfortunately, the box was locked and there was no key. Smithson, feeling the subject of some cruel joke played on him, turned on the terrified men. "You are paid good money to work here on this contract, and instead of carrying out a simple task, you make up this cock and bull story instead." Picking up a crowbar from Jacobs's bag, he threw it on the floor in front of the two bewildered men and snapped, "Now finish the job or I shall sack you both immediately." Under his supervision, the men completed the task and they went home. It appeared to be a small sturdy box handmade by a blacksmith and looked to date from the 18th century. It was undamaged and bore no sign of wear or rust, which quite surprised him. He was no expert, but he knew of a respected Oldborough antiques dealer who might be able to help. Having locked up the house and site for the night, he drove to the shop in question, where he was able to catch the owner, Michael Burgess, before closing. Burgess, whose thin, long face sported round-rimmed glasses which were crowned with a mass of grey, thinning, unkempt hair, had a scholarly, educated look about him and was quite knowledgeable with antiques and objets d'art. Complemented in dress by an oversized cardigan and black trousers, he exemplified an eccentric academic. Smithson presented the box to him, which immediately elicited a reaction of surprise and joy from Burgess's now excited face as he lifted it to the light and stared quietly and intently for a few minutes, observing in some detail every facet. As he placed the box on a table, he finally spoke. "This is a small travelling strongbox used for jewellery and important personal items. It is handmade and suggests a date between 1700 to 1800. It certainly has a good rattle, so there may be something of value within. Have you a key?" Smithson responded that he hadn't, and Burgess disappeared briefly to the back of the shop, from where he emerged with a box of old-fashioned skeleton keys. Selecting 20 that would fit the keyhole of the escutcheon plate, he played around with the keys before one eventually turned the lock and opened the box. The lid was very stiff, but after some effort and a little oil, it opened. By coincidence, the process was hampered when the lights flickered and the room felt briefly colder, but both men laughed it off as they continued excitedly to examine the contents of the box. They were surprised to see that it contained a large collection of gold rings of various descriptions, from wedding to signet. Some had diamonds or rubies, others were plain gold bands. Burgess examined them all for hallmarks through a monocular magnifying glass and said, "These date between 1690 and 1710, and the gold is 22 carat, which was the legal standard then. Collectively with the diamond and ruby settings, this is worth around £20,000. Would you mind if I asked where you acquired these?" Smithson, visibly shocked, sat down to regain composure, commenting, "This box was found hidden under the floorboards at Salton Hall by some workers." Burgess replied, "How strange they should all be rings of different sizes and obviously from many people. I have never seen that before. And the fact that they were hidden does raise some questions." Smithson agreed and thanked him, and then took the box and left to return to his cottage on the outskirts of the town. That night in his sleep, Smithson found himself back at Salton Hall. This was a different time, and the house was in good repair with staff busily working inside and outside the home. By their appearance and the interior furnishings, it looked to be around the mid-18th century. He wandered outside into the walled garden, which was immaculately laid to lawn, and they met a tall, slim man dressed in a black tricorn hat and a cloak. The man was in his late 30s and had a handsome, fine-featured face with dark hair tied into a ponytail. Observing more closely, he wore a fine woolen dark frock coat with close-fitting knee breeches in matching cloth fastened at the knee with a buckle. The frock coat had a broad full front opening, and the snug fit showed off finely knitted silk stockings. To his side was attached a sword, and on his right hand was a large gold signet ring with the initials in a florid style depicting T.S. He walked over to him, removed his hat, bowed to Smithson, and casually introduced himself as Thomas Salton, the Squire of the Marshes and owner of the hall. "Good sir," he said, "I'm given to understand that you possess some mere trinkets I have collected. Could you be of good service and return them from whence you had removed them?" Smithson, despite knowing he was dreaming, felt strongly that he had been transported through time. He responded by telling Salton that the items had been found abandoned and would be handed over to the hall's new owners at the first opportunity. Salton became very angry as his face narrowed into a rage and quickly revealed a flintlock pistol from his belt, which he aimed and fired at him. Smithson felt a ball of lead rip into his body, and in an instant he was awake in his bed back in Aldborough with a chest pain and a cold sweat that soon passed with no injury, save for a round red mark on his chest where he felt he was struck. It was then a chill down his spine made him realise that this experience was more than a dream. He also felt a pervasive atmosphere now in the cottage, and on one occasion was sure he spotted the fleeting shadow of Salton. The next morning he drove to a safe depository at a nearby bank which held an account for the renovation project. Having received a receipt for the box left in their charge, he drove to the Aldborough Museum, which was housed in the beautiful 16th century Moot Hall building on the beachfront, whereupon he spoke to an elderly gentleman named Perkins, who was a volunteer archivist and historian. Mr. Perkins, an educated man in his late 70s, welcomed him into the timber-frame building and said, "How can I help you?" Smithson identified himself as the Salton Hall project manager and asked if he had heard of a Thomas Salton who was master of the hall. Mr. Perkins was surprised he had heard of Salton's name, replied, "Well, yes, I do know this chap fairly well. He was a dark character in his day, and was said to have acquired a great wealth through piracy, smuggling and plundering wrecks caught in storms off the coast. In fact, any criminal activity that kept him in wealth and good comfort." Smithson asked, "Did he build the hall as it seems to be in such a quiet and remote location?" Perkins pondered briefly and replied, "Yes, indeed he did. I believe it was financed from the wreck of the Prudence Usher, a brigantine passenger ship which came ashore in a great storm in February 1740. In total, 75 lives were lost, and it was believed she was lured ashore by lights placed by him and his men to make them believe they were coming into Aldborough. Instead, they ran ashore." He paused and continued, "According to legend, not all drowned, and some made it safely to shore. Salton and his men were believed to have murdered those survivors." He shook his frail head. "The tragedy is that there were many women passengers with children who were hoping to sail to America to start a new life, but Salton ensured that none survived. After plundering the ship and the corpses, the wreck drifted out to sea and sank. Would the goods they had stolen have included jewellery from the victims?" Absolutely. From later accounts of villagers that attended the wreck, they reported that in some instances the bodies were naked, having had their clothing removed, although this was never confirmed. He paused. But sadly, none of this was ever proven against him, and some years later he simply disappeared and was never seen again. I believe a later owner of the hall erected a small commemorative monument to Prudence Usher in the grounds, which is still there today. During his time in the museum, as well as the earlier visit to the bank, Smithson felt an uncomfortable presence around him. That feeling of unease seemingly accompanied him back to Salton Hall, where he continued to supervise the work in progress. From then on, workmen complained of bad smells, unaccounted noises, strange shadows, and their tools disappearing and reappearing elsewhere in the building. But regardless, they soldiered on, and by January of the following year, a majority of the work was completed on schedule. It was then that Giles and Amanda came down to inspect the work and be the honoured first guests, as the master bedroom had not only been restored, but it was now carpeted and furnished to their tastes. With them was a retinue of staff from their Mayfair home, which included the cook, a maid, a valet, and the butler, who were similarly accommodated in the completed bedrooms. All were impressed with the almost renovated building. There were smaller issues to be completed, and the lounge was only half decorated. Still, regardless, it was habitable and, importantly, brightly lit with the electricity and with warm fires in every room. The couple congratulated Smithson, and he presented them with the safe box and rings to take back to London. They were aware of the backstory concerning the discovery, but obviously not of the strange matters which had seemingly happened in connection with them. Giles tipped the contents onto a table, both gasping in appreciation, whereupon Amanda selected a rather unusually heavy signet ring, which caused Giles to say, "No, it cannot be." "What?" responded a curious Amanda. "Look, darling, the ring is embossed with my family crest. How can that be?" It was then that he remembered vaguely a family story concerning a half-forgotten ancestor, Sir Rupert Frobisher, who died aboard a sailing ship which was sailing to America, where he had owned a plantation. "I am finding this all rather weird to see this, and how the deuce it came to be hidden beneath." He stopped. "Oh my God!" he exclaimed. "The Prudence Usher! Do you remember the Stele, darling, in the garden?" "Yes, Giles, it was sunk here in 1740, as I remember." Giles, now dizzy with shock, sat in an armchair, and Amanda poured a small brandy, which she brought to him. "Drink this, my dear. Yes, I am feeling as shocked as you." Giles drank the brandy and sat momentarily silent and frozen as the enormity of this discovery washed over him. Smithson, who was still on the premises, was summoned to the lounge by the butler, where he shared his knowledge of the discovery and his research, but he remained reticent about the ghostly experiences with both him and the workmen, as he did not wish to cause further unease. "So," said Giles, "this chap Thomas Salton, who built this house, may have done so on the proceeds of crime, and worse, the blood of my family. As I remember, Rupert was, I believe, transporting a chest of gold with him to be used in conjunction with the American estate, and this bounder probably plundered that too, and the lives of so many innocent people." Amanda interjected, "But regardless, he built this beautiful house, which, if you like, has been returned to us despite the misuse of your ancestors' gold." As they spoke, Smithson felt a terrible anger in the air, which to him was real and palpable, and he knew deep inside that Salton had more tricks to play before the end of their stay. He therefore decided to share with them his sleep-related experiences of Salton and the incident involving the workmen. Surprisingly, the Frobishers were quite unfazed, and dismissing the stories, stated that they had no intentions of leaving the hall, which they loved very much. During the night, the Frobishers were convinced that they had heard footsteps creeping around the bedroom in the dark, but upon turning on the light, the room remained silent. Having called out to the invisible walker to leave them alone, they returned to their slumbers without further incident, although they accepted that the house appeared haunted. The next day, the Frobishers left the hall early to spend the day walking across the vast expanse of marshland, while workmen were in the rear digging a deep trench to improve drainage issues at the house. At the same time, decorators worked busily in the interior to finish the house for the February completion. It was during the mid-morning that the labourers digging the trench reported that they had struck what seemed to be a stone slab buried a few feet down in the ground. Curious, Smithson ordered them to dig around the slab and expose whatever lay buried below. While they dug, he supervised them before being satisfied that they had exposed what appeared to be a stone sarcophagus. Bringing in extra men, the slab was carefully removed and placed to one side, where they saw inside what was the skeleton of a human being with the remains of rotted clothing. It was then that Smithson noticed that next to a hand lay a gold signet ring that bore in florid lettering the initials T.S. It was the one he had seen in his dream of his meeting with Thomas Salton, and he knew that his missing remains were his. To follow legal process, he informed the police of the burial, who attended in the early afternoon with a forensic expert in the form of Dr. J. A. Andrews, whose expertise determined that it was indeed an ancient burial and beyond the need of any police investigation, and that by examining some damaged vertebra, it appeared the owner in life may have been stabbed to death. By the time of Dr. Andrews' arrival, the Frobishers had returned and were shocked at the discovery. They, having consulted with the police and Dr. Andrews, the remains were removed and placed in a canvas bag, whereupon they were taken immediately to nearby St. Mark's Church, where the vicar, following a generous donation from the Frobishers, arranged in the early evening to have the remains interred after a short service in an unmarked grave on the north side of the church. And secretly buried with Salton was the metal strongbox with the remainder of the jewellery, as they now in part believed Smithson's ghostly dream and decided they would feel better without these items. From that day forward, the Frobishers, and indeed Smithson, were not plagued by the odious presence of Thomas Salton, who had finally found his peace, and the house was completed without further incident in February, and as arranged they took up residence. Although some claim the churchyard is haunted by his presence today, this is merely a rumour, and no other sightings of Salton have been reported. The End. The Will, written and read by Christopher Halton. April was a chilly month in late Victorian smog-infested London. The chimneys lining every street belched out acrid grey smoke, contributing to the heavy, misty vapour that lingered in the wet morning air. The sun struggled in vain to penetrate the pall that hung over London like a shroud of despair. On the bustling thoroughfares of central London, shoppers clutched their coats tightly around their necks, suffering from the noxious fumes as they congregated like ants along Bond Street's flagstones, weaving through a cavalcade of carriages and horse-drawn trams. The challenge of navigating these crowded, smoggy streets often led to coachmen shouting at one another as they narrowly avoided collisions. This scene was also a melting pot of street beggars, costermongers, coffee sellers, muffin men, and baked potato vendors, creating even more hurdles for ordinary people attempting to go about their daily routines. Amidst this intense rat race of humanity was John Mortimer, a young solicitor grappling with the demands of his work at his uncle's practice, Mortimer and Mortimer. His duties included pleading for plaintiffs and defending miscreants at the nearby courthouse. While he loved his job and appreciated his uncle's support, John longed for a quieter life away from the city, dreaming of a rural refuge far from the hustle and bustle of civilization. He often shared his frustrations with his uncle, Sir Thomas Mortimer, a successful barrister and a convincing orator. Of course, his uncle employed his verbosity to repeatedly dissuade him from leaving. However, on this particularly dismal day in London, John felt a glimmer of hope. Having just returned to the office from Bow Street Magistrates' Court, his uncle summoned him to his well-appointed office, which was lined with bookcases full of legal tomes and a glittering display of awards and plaques from his long and distinguished career in law practice. Sir Thomas, an immaculately dressed, well-rounded man with thinning grey hair, substantial bushy sideburns, and a short stubby nose which perched a tiny pair of round horn-rimmed glasses, invited him joyfully to sit at his huge mahogany desk, a driving symbolism of his power and prestige within the legal community. He playfully swivelled from side to side in a large oak captain's chair while he fiddled with a quill pen. He smiled excitedly as he dreamily scanned the office in silence, before finally settling his beady eyes upon his young nephew John, whereupon his face took on a more serious tone before commenting, "I have a task for you of the utmost importance in the West Country, young man. Are you willing to undertake it on behalf of the practice?" John agreeably responded, "Oh yes, uncle." Sir Thomas snapped back, "Never agree to anything before knowing what the task entails, John. I told you this many a time." He briefly sighed, but then his face lit up again as he continued, "But I think you will jolly well like this one, and it is an important client's estate for which I have represented for many years." He stood up, he walked round to where John was sat, and having perched his corpulent frame on the edge of the desk, said, "Lord Featherstone of Quigley has recently died. He was found dead by his housekeeper, Mrs. Carling, lying on the floor in the dining room. Poor chap had died apparently of a heart attack." He cleared his throat. "He never deposited a copy of his will with us, but I understand an updated copy is in his office safe or possibly in his desk drawer. He was not, unfortunately, as diligent with his affairs as I would have hoped. I want you to leave tomorrow by train and go to Featherstone Hall. There you will find that will, and then, while waving a sealed letter, administer the disposal of his estate by authority of this document signed by Lord Featherstone, which gives you a power of attorney after you locate and read the missing will. You will communicate with me weekly by letter and send me a progress report on how matters are proceeding. Algy, his lordship, was a close personal friend and has no heirs. I know I am a beneficiary, but quite apart from that, Lord Featherstone was a senior figure in the House of Lords, and the prestige of handling his estate will greatly benefit the practice you will inherit." He paused, returned to his chair and said, "Don't let me down with this. I chose you because apart from being my nephew, you are the most promising young solicitor who has ever worked for me." He pulled out a fob watch from his Savile Row-tailored suit and remarked, as he stared at its face. "Now run along, John. Go home and pack for a 3 to 4 week stay. I will have you collected at 10 a.m. tomorrow and taken to Waterloo. You will get off at Eastleigh, and a hansom cab will take you to the hall. Got that? Good." With that he left the office for a meeting, and John returned to his lodgings to pack for the trip, which he was duly excited about. As arranged the following day, he was collected and taken to Waterloo railway station before boarding the Eastleigh train, which he alighted from a few hours later. Although the passengers and railway porters were present, the station felt almost empty compared to London. The sky was sunny and bright, and people seemed more relaxed as birds sang nearby in a large old oak tree that must have been planted centuries ago with wide-spreading branches that resembled a welcoming gesture to passengers old and new as it leaned slightly over the platform, offering shade and comfort to weary travellers. To John, all this was a world away from the chaos of central London. Having offloaded 2 large trunk cases and a portmanteau from the baggage train, 2 cheerfully rewarded porters placed the luggage on top of a waiting hansom cab, whose driver, a stout middle-aged West Country gentleman replete with a wide grin, rosy red cheeks, and wearing a top hat and grey cape, said warmly to John, "No need to pay for the fare, sir. That was arranged at Featherstone Hall, which we should reach in around 40 minutes. So just sit back and let me and my nag Nelly get you there very soon." Before climbing up on the raised driver's seat, he added, "Lovely day, sir, for a ride in the country, I can say." For John, who sat inside impatiently waiting to start his work, this all seemed more of a holiday than a labour. Despite a slight chill in the spring air, it was a relaxed journey through quiet country lanes and seemingly happier country folk going about their day as they laboured on the land, or, in others, cattle grazed lazily in the rich green fields. John sighed. Here in this sojourn was a life he yearned to live, yet for now it was a dream from the humdrum existence he had left some hours before on the platform of Waterloo railway station. Before long, the cab arrived at the entrance to Featherstone Hall. Waiting outside the main entrance was a tall, plain-looking, slim woman in her early 50s, wearing a dark brown dress and apron. She seemed rather glum at John's appearance as he emerged from the cab. While the driver and 2 footmen removed the luggage, John, aware of this apparent hostility, smiled and doffed his hat as he introduced himself to the woman who was his contact, Mrs. Carling, the governess of the house. Having shaken hands, she gave a slight formal curtsy and said rather sternly, "Although his lordship is no longer with us, I am engaged by the estate to work here until my services are no longer needed. I have been here for 20 years, and as I am sure you can appreciate, it is my home, and therefore any questions or queries you may have that appertain to the estate, you must direct them through me." She turned as another figure arrived, an elderly butler named Fisher, who slowly shuffled and took John into the house to show him his room. Once out of earshot, Fisher, peering suspiciously around, spoke in a subdued voice to say, "Mrs. Carling is naturally an unpleasant lady, sir, but the late Lord Featherstone thought the world of her. She is, it is fair to say, a very efficient woman at her tasks, and will, I know, be of great help." He paused and added with a smile, "If you can put up with her lack of personality, sir." John chuckled and said, "After living in London, I can assure you, Fisher, that her absence of warmth is something I am sadly accustomed to." Finding Fisher a far more agreeable chap, he decided to use his services at any opportunity and keep his dealings with Mrs. Carling confined purely to business. It is worth noting that Featherstone Hall was a fine late Tudor timber-framed house of brick and tile with a later and more extensive Georgian plastered extension. The house comprised of 15 bedrooms, 3 of which were en suite. John's room within the hall was one en suite in the Georgian portion, with an added writing desk and some shelf storage for several legal texts to assist with his duties. Lord Featherstone had his own office and library downstairs in the same wing, but this arrangement suited John admirably for practicality and privacy away from Mrs. Carling's peering eyes. Apart from the butler and Mrs. Carling, the retained staff included 2 footmen, a cook, and 3 maids who either lived in the main house or lived within the estate in cottages. Outside staff were 3 gardeners, a stable lad, and a gamekeeper, whose salaries were now under his control as an executor. But before the process could continue to dissolve the estate and its assets, locating the will was of the utmost importance. The following day, after a well-rested sleep and breakfast, John went to Featherstone's office to retrieve the missing document. Having been provided with the keys and combinations for the safe and desk drawer by Mrs. Carling, John soon realized the will was missing. He summoned Mrs. Carling into the office and asked her where the will was to be located. She scowled with a seething but restrained contempt and replied, "His lordship left a copy, I believe, in his desk. I am not privy to its details, and as far as I was aware, the will is still there." John replied, "Well, Mrs. Carling, it is not, and neither is it in the safe where I feel it should have been kept. Who else had access, Mrs. Carling?" She replied quite impertinently, "Am I the suspect then, Mr. Mortimer? After all, only I had the desk key and the combination to the safe, but I can assure you it has nothing whatsoever to do with me. Perhaps his lordship mislaid it. After all, he was in his 70s, and age can affect one's memory." She turned towards the door and added, "You will have to forgive me. There is nothing more I can assist you with, as I am sure it will turn up in the house." With that she was gone. John immediately dispatched a letter to his uncle outlining the missing will and his suspicions about Mrs. Carling, whom he felt may have had too much influence over the late lord. However, he promised to dig deeper into this and also re-examine the circumstances of his death, which may not have been simply due to natural causes, as Mrs. Carling had reportedly discovered his body. But that was an aside to the will. It had either been stolen, or Lord Featherstone was forced to conceal it somewhere. The mystery deepened. A few nights later, John was aroused from his sleep by the sound of footsteps quietly walking around the bedroom floor. They sounded as though the owner wasn't wearing any footwear. He lay there quietly, pretending to sleep, as he saw a partial silhouette against the curtainless window, which shone weak light from the moon into the room. He lay there frozen in fear as he felt the pounding of his heart against his rib cage. This was followed by the sound of fingers rifling through papers on his desk, before the footsteps quietly went to the corner of his room, and after a fumbling sound they disappeared. Summoning all the courage he could muster, he leapt out of bed and shone a light from an electric torch on a bedside cabinet. But whatever or whoever it was had gone. Although he did not hear his door open, he decided to go into the corridor that led to a staircase. But again nothing, just silence and emptiness as he swept his light beam up and down into the dark void beyond. It was evident that whoever came into his room lived or worked in the hall, and again Mrs. Carling became the chief suspect. But he pondered how to catch her. Nothing in the bedroom was missing, and the creeper left no clues. The next day he held a staff meeting with all employees in the dining hall, the only room large enough to accommodate everyone comfortably. Mrs. Carling, having ensured everyone was present and seated, sat immediately to the front row of 2 rows of chairs placed out. She sat frowning and staring with her arms folded, with a look of abject disdain as she stared at John and looked away again. John explained to the gathered staff the reason he was working at the estate and the duties that his role entailed. He assured them that they were still employed and would be paid regularly, and for those living as tenants, their right to live there would remain, with protection for its workers. He urged them to approach him directly and confidently if they had any concerns. He did not disclose, however, the missing will. When he asked for any questions, the audience remained silent, with some looking cautiously over to where the indomitable Mrs. Carling was seated. Clearly, he thought, the hierarchical power of this woman was self-evident. Thereafter, the meeting was terminated, and the staff broke away to continue their duties. By arrangement through Mrs. Carling, John next examined the estate's financial records, as he was responsible for ensuring all disbursements were paid. He found that Mrs. Carling, in her role as administrator, had handled the financial affairs with due diligence, and he later commended her for her honesty and attention to detail. He therefore asked her to continue as before, as he did not want to impinge upon her duties and responsibilities there. She almost broke out into a smile and thanked him. Feeling more relaxed about Mrs. Carling's abilities and honesty, he still thought she may have been the creeper in his room. Without further evidence to support that contention, he decided to wait and see what would happen next. This woman was very intelligent and capable, which worried him more as she could undermine his efforts at the hall, or worse. John organised 2 footmen to empty Lord Featherstone's office to the bare walls to determine where the missing will might be. Over the course of a day, his desk, a davenport, chairs, small tables and books were all removed from the room. Every book was opened to see whether it concealed documents, and a large Persian carpet was removed for closer examination. The davenport, a small writing desk with a secret drawer, was also examined to no avail, and Featherstone's desk was checked from underneath for hidden compartments. Lastly, 3 oils and 2 prints from the walls were removed from their frames, but despite the many hours employed, nothing could be found. Next, a detailed examination of the bookcase and the bare walls was made, again looking for hidden niches or compartments. After some hours, John acknowledged that the office had no secrets, and everything had been returned in situ. Nothing of any material weight occurred over the next few days. John found that despite the pressures entailing his task with the missing will, he decided to tour the estate and chat one-on-one with each of its workers. Most were civilly polite, but despite his attempts to draw the will and Mrs. Carling into the conversation, nobody, it seemed, was prepared to come out into the open about their suspicions, except for one, the stable lad named Will Compton. Here he found an altogether more engaging young man of a similar age, who was tall and slim, with a mop of brown wavy hair and an engaging smile. "I hear you are looking for that missing will, sir, but with Mrs. Carling around, I found it difficult to speak with you on such matters. I've been here some 2 years now. My father, Dick, used to work for Lord Featherstone as his coach driver, and both of them were on very good terms with each other. I know because Dad spoke about him often. Sadly, Dad passed away last year." "And what of the will?" John asked. "Sorry, sir, I was getting to that. Well, a couple of months before Dad passed away, his lordship told him that he would keep the estate cottage as his own after he passed on, and in any regard, in the event of his death, the next of kin, that is my mother, would be the one who receives it. Dad at that time wasn't a strong man, and a month before he died he had to stop working through his illness. His lordship ensured that we were well taken care of, and in return he entrusted to my mother a steel box and asked that she kept it secret until he too passed on, after which the case was to be handed to the estate's executor, which I know now is you." John interjected, "Where is this case now?" Will replied, "At home, about a 5-minute walk from here. I will take you there shortly." John felt much more relaxed at the thought of hopefully retrieving the will, and together they trudged through a small woodland before arriving at a delightful stone and thatched roof 3-bedroom cottage. Inside, John met Will's mother, Agnes, who, after being introduced, took him into a cosy lounge where a fire burned in the hearth. Agnes, a small lady in her mid-50s with petite features, brown hair tied in a bun, and wearing a black full-length dress, urged John to sit down, where he was served tea while Will brought in a small but stout metal strongbox. Handing the box to John as he sat in a Windsor chair, Will produced a key which he inserted into the lock and turned. Once open, there were several legal documents, a letter, and Lord Featherstone's will, which was sealed with red wax and bearing his seal. It was dated 12 months previously, and the attached letter signed by Lord Featherstone confirmed the assigned handling of the estate to the Mortimers, and had an added codicil that the will was to be opened and read in the full presence of all staff members. Having received all of the contents from the strong box, John thanked the Comptons for their honesty and left the cottage to return alone on foot, which allowed time to reason why Lord Featherstone would hand something so important as his will to estate workers. Perhaps in the documents there was some indication why he did so, but clearly there was someone at the hall that his lordship did not trust. While walking through the woodland, he realized that someone or something was watching his every move. He could not see anyone or detect any movement in the thick scrub, but that feeling was not going away. There was some malevolent force at play, and he now feared for his safety if it was known that he now possessed the will. When he returned to the hall, he immediately went to his impromptu office in his bedroom and locked the door. Once seated at his desk, he removed the documents from a leather holdall loaned by the Comptons. He proceeded to separate and stack them into 2 heaps for legal and personal documentation. It was Featherstone's own letters that he challenged first. It seemed that before his death, he was convinced that a staff member was plotting to kill him, but the letters did not indicate identity, except to say that an attempt was made to poison him 2 years past by administering in his tea potassium cyanide, which, although making him sick, did not kill him. He knew that it was cyanide, and a bottle kept in storage was found later to be empty, and that, according to the advice of the family doctor, should have killed him if it were not for the fact that the poison had been stored for several years, after which it had decomposed to cyanocarbonate, an inert and harmless substance. The police at that time were not informed, but a private detective was engaged to investigate. He later succumbed to an accidental drowning in a nearby river. On this occasion, the coroner had decided that the detective had slipped from a muddy bank whilst out walking and was drowned in the fast-flowing waters. What if, he thought, that the detective was murdered? 2 strange deaths and attempted murder over a relatively short period add up very strongly that someone here at the hall was involved in some nefarious activity. And of course, what is to say that his own life was now in danger? And lastly, he thought, For what purpose? That night, as he lay asleep in bed, he was awakened by a presence in the room. Upon waking, somewhat bleary-eyed, he was shocked and horrified to see a glowing grey figure, the late Lord Featherstone, who wore an expression of anguish on his face. Featherstone walked from the foot of the bed to a corner of the room, where a wall panel opened on its own. He gestured for young Mortimer to follow him as he vanished inside. Surprisingly, John did not feel afraid. Instead, with his flashlight in hand, he stepped into a hidden world, a secret corridor that led behind Featherstone's ghostly form into yet another passage. This corridor led to a flight of wooden steps that ascended into the attic. It was there that Featherstone faded away, leaving John in front of a large old metal trunk. Kneeling, he opened it and discovered a scrapbook related to the Featherstone family, revealing that Lord Featherstone was not the last of his line. The scrapbook indicated that the second Lord Featherstone had an elder son from another mother. A birth certificate confirmed this, identifying the child as William Fisher, born out of wedlock with the father's name left unknown. "Oh my God," he thought, "it's the butler, Fisher." As he rummaged through more documents, he found a photo of the young William with his mother, Eliza Fisher, who clearly lived in poverty, as evidenced by their clothing and the backdrop of an old tenement building. As the light dimmed, he quickly gathered these, along with some handwritten letters, into his dressing gown and returned to his room. During the return journey, he realized that these secret corridors were intended for staff use, a fact that Lord Featherstone had likely been aware of. Upon returning to his room, he jammed the secret panel door shut and locked his bedroom door. For the next hour, he immersed himself in reading the documents he had retrieved from the attic. Featherstone's father appeared to have been involved with a maid while married. When she became pregnant from this affair, he paid her 5 guineas and forced her to leave the estate. Raising a child out of wedlock was unacceptable in polite English society, and she was never allowed to return to her previous occupation. Instead, she ended up living in abject poverty, making a few pennies as a washerwoman, or at times begging on the streets of London for food or money. She died when William was 16 years old, being old and worn out before her time. At that point, he started to work as a boy servant with a wealthy banking family, where he developed his skills to the position of butler and was eventually employed at Featherstone Hall, a place he naturally felt was meant for him. William, however, had incriminated himself in a diary where he admitted to the death of his brother by arsenic poisoning and the murder of a detective whom he lured to a river under false pretenses, where he pushed him into a fast-flowing river to drown. And yet, when he considered it, Fisher was the last person anyone would suspect of being a killer. In his early 70s and not in good physical shape, Fisher tended to shuffle as he walked, but maintained a congenial personality. Throughout John's stay, he was always available to offer advice, or even fetch the odd late-night glass of brandy. John was mistaken to think that Mrs. Carling was the main suspect, for as the saying goes, never judge a book by its cover. During the morning of the following day, he realized that he had little time before Fisher knew of his discovery in the attic. He decided to take a pony and trap to the neighbouring town of Holtsham to summon assistance from the police. John walked over to the stables where a maid had taken a message to Will Compton to prepare a pony and trap for his use. When he walked into the stable block, a long narrow brick building with 12 horse stalls, he saw Fisher standing near the entrance in his butler attire with his hands behind his back. He seemed much more energetically youthful in his demeanour and braced his legs as he smiled at John's approach. "Good afternoon, Master John. Are we off somewhere then? Would you like me to accompany you?" No, Fisher. I'm looking for Will, the stable lad." Pointing his head to an empty stall and smirking, he replied, "I'm afraid he is out for the moment." John walked over to where he had indicated and saw poor Will lying unconscious on the stable floor. He was horrified, and as he turned to confront him, Fisher pulled from behind his back a revolver, which he recognised had been taken from Lord Featherstone's gun cabinet. Aiming at his head, he said, "You and I will go now to collect my half-brother's will. Yes, I know you now have it, and if you don't give it to me, you will get some lead instead." "Why do you need this will, Fisher?" he replied confidently. "So I may destroy it, you young fool, and then lay my claim to the title and the estate. And what will happen to both Will and I?" He replied matter-of-factly, "Well, I can't have any witnesses, and let's face it, I, being the eldest, have always been the rightful heir to this estate, and you two present a threat to what is mine by birth." Just as John was about to accede to his request and face the dark consequences of what may come after, a shot from behind Fisher rang out, and Fisher fell face first onto the ground, dead. From the smoke of a firearm appeared Mrs. Carling holding a rifle. John exclaimed, "My God, are you involved?" She lowered the weapon, smiled forcibly, rested it against a stall, and said, "No, but I have had suspicions about Fisher for some time. I have been in love with Lord Featherstone for 20 years. We were inseparable, but because of my humble background, society would never have accepted us married. And when I found my dear Algy dead that morning from a suspected heart attack, my entire world collapsed. That is why I did not want to see you come here and destroy the one true home I had." She then tended to Will, who, apart from a bruise on his head, had fully recovered. She then added, "I saw Fisher walking over here earlier and found a handgun missing from the cabinet, and I assumed the worst and brought this rifle with me. My suspicions started after the detective drowned. I recall Fisher being the last person seen with him, and frankly he was always near or not too far away when my darling Algy almost died from poisoning the first time, and when I found him dead the second time." The following day, after the police had conducted their investigation following the removal of Fisher's corpse, they were satisfied, pending a coroner's court, that Mrs. Carling had acted in self-defence. Later that day, the will was read in the dining hall to the gathered staff. It was revealed that Mrs. Carling was to inherit the estate, while the Comptons were bequeathed the estate cottage. All other staff members would receive £100 each. Furthermore, all stocks and shares were to be sold. Mrs. Carling would receive 1,000 guineas annually from a trust fund, and Lord Featherstone's friend and lawyer, Sir Thomas Mortimer, would receive £5,000. Lord Featherstone never appeared before young Mortimer again, evidently satisfied that justice had finally been served, and Mrs. Carling was later vindicated for shooting Fisher during a coroner's court session. After the drama of rural life, John Mortimer never wanted to leave London again. In a few years he took over the practice from his uncle, who had finally decided to retire. He passed his robe and wig into the capable hands of his nephew, who was now a practising barrister. The end. The School of Lost Souls, written and read by Christopher Halton. Many years ago, as a young teacher, my first role was substituting for regular salaried staff when they were ill or away from their school. In this case, I was sent by the school board to a 2-classroom village school situated in a small rural hamlet called Bacon's End, which was located in the Norfolk Broads and relatively isolated from the outside world. As such, the bulk of the pupils, aged between 5 and 12 years, were the offspring of local farm workers and staff employed at 2 country houses, Blessingfield Hall and Morton Abbey. In total, there were around 50 children, divided by sex into girls' and boys' classrooms. The headmistress was Mrs. Amelia Davidson, and being a man, I was assigned to the boys' class, while Miss Alice Johnson taught the girls. Both ladies had taught there for many years, and were doughty women of middle age. Bacon's End Church of England School was a brick and flint walled building with an H-shaped layout and a grey slate roof. It was divided into two wings, each housing the girls' and boys' sections, with the middle section serving as the entrance and office for Mrs. Davidson, as well as a small staff room. Additionally, either side had a small changing room and toilets for the children. At the back, the play area was a small grassy field, separated by a brick and flint wall that segregated the boys and girls, as it was considered improper for both groups to mingle during school hours. Overall, the school was structurally attractive, but standing outside and looking in, I felt a pervasive darkness about the place. Although this was 1910, the school was deeply ingrained with Victorian values, which were the standards set by both men and women. The missing member of staff was Mrs. Davidson's husband, Alfred, who I was told was ill with an undisclosed disability and would not be returning for at least 6 months. Given this, Lord Evanston from Morton Abbey had provided me with staff quarters at the house, and as the Abbey was 2 miles from the school, a cycle was supplied to allow me to commute to and from the school during my tenure. I arrived at the school on a warm and balmy Friday afternoon in mid-July, and yet on the path leading into the school I saw some wet footprints of a child glistening in the sun, which led towards the school entrance. I naturally thought this odd, but then I reasoned that children sometimes do some of the strangest things, and I gave it no further thought. I then saw a man, a groundsman named Adams, who was mowing the grass at the school's front lawn. It was just after school at 4 p.m, and all the children had left to return home. Adams, although noticing my arrival, did not immediately react to my presence and puffed away on a clay meerschaum pipe as he sullenly pushed the heavy mower across the grass, leaving a trail of thick smoke in his wake, like an old steam engine slowly gathering speed. Feeling somewhat bemused by his attitude, I waited a minute or so before he reached the end of the lawn and said, "Hello, sorry to trouble you, but could you direct me, please, to Mrs. Davidson's office?" Adams stopped and turned to me and said, "You'll be that new teacher, Mr. Holmes, eh?" Scarcely a smile appeared on his face as he spoke, and not once did he show any modicum of civility, other than to point to a sash window to the left of the entrance. I thanked him, and having doffed my hat, I bade him good day and entered the school, having left my cycle and trouser clips on the wall just inside the gate. I shortly arrived at a heavy oak door which bore a blue and white enamel plaque with the title Head Mistress. As I stood before it, a sense of apprehension washed over me. If Adams the groundsman was anything to go by, I was in for a daunting encounter. I hesitantly rapped the door once with my knuckles, and a woman's voice boomed from within. "Please come in, Mr. Holmes." Having entered the rather spacious room, I saw Mrs. Davidson sitting at her desk writing, and seemingly oblivious to my presence. I also noticed above her head, on the whitewashed plastered wall behind her, a large mahogany picture frame displaying printed religious text, which read, "He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes." To the side of her rather plain-looking pine desk was an oak bookcase, which contained numerous books, all of which, as far as I could see, were religious treatises. Other than an attractive school clock, there were no other adornments on the walls, and the room felt dark and heavy with the presence of this woman. Still averting her gaze from me as she wrote, she mumbled, "Be with you shortly, Mr. Holmes. Please take a seat." I sat down on an old mahogany carver dining chair by her desk, and spent the next 2 minutes studying her closely in some detail. She was around 55 years old, of stout build, typical of the country districts, and was plainly attired in a V-necked dress that featured a solitary pinned plain gold-coloured brooch. Her grey hair was tied back in a bun, and her face was round with heavy jowls and pasty-looking skin. She sported a pair of pince-nez glasses and wore no other jewellery. Her sheer presence impressed upon me, and so far few words. Presently she put down her pen on blotting paper, and having grimaced a forced smile, said, "Thank you, Mr. Holmes, for stepping in while my poor husband Alfred is away ill from his teaching duties. I like to run a very tight ship here, and I am intolerant of poor discipline." She paused to study my face briefly and continued, "I see from the school board report that you are 25 years old, and this is your first teaching assignment. What experience do you have of teaching children then?" I replied, "Well, while studying for my teaching degree, I have had on-site teaching experience at schools in Norwich, and I am well versed in English language, English literature, history, geography, and arithmetic." I then added, "But this is my first appointment as a sole teacher in charge of a class." She folded her arms and looked dismissively at me. "You would not be my first choice, Mr. Holmes. I prefer staff to be older and more hands-on in their teaching than some of the nonsense being taught nowadays." Somewhat shocked, I replied, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Davidson, what do you mean?" "Well, I will not encourage you to be lax in the application of discipline with children." She added, "Spare the rod and spoil the child is my maxim, and that has always guided me to a well-ordered classroom." I assured her that at all times I would apply proper punishment as and when required, but foremost I would reassure my charges that I am there to teach and guide them, and not to find excuses to punish unnecessarily. She smiled menacingly and replied, "Well, Mr. Holmes, we will see, won't we?" She then took me on a tour of the school, which was built in 1865 from money provided by benefactors from the two neighbouring country estates. As we walked around the building, there was something very odd and intangible about the general vibe of the building itself, which suggested that something much darker and sinister lay within the very fabric of its walls. However, before my imagination dwelt more deeply, I was sharply brought back to the reality of the moment as Mrs. Davidson discussed the general administration matters governing the school. She added that, as is customary with Christian schools, we would meet in the church hall next door at 7 a.m. for assembly, and classes would commence at 8 a.m. with a 15-minute break at 11 a.m. for which I would supervise my charges in the play area. Lunch would be from 1 to 2 p.m. and classes would terminate at 4 p.m. She tapped her cane against a desk. "You'll learn that discipline here is not optional." Her lips curved, if only slightly, at the idea of a misbehaving child. Taking note of her demeanour, I replied, "I will do my best, Mrs. Davidson." After touring the school, she formally introduced me to Adams, who was sitting outside in his groundsman's shed, sharpening a scythe with a whetstone with hard, aggressive sweeps. On seeing the approach of Mrs. Davidson, Adams immediately stood up and doffed his cap at her presence. I thought what a change of attitude he had with her after my initial meeting with him. Adams was a scrawny-looking fellow of short stature in his late 40s. He was dressed in a rough-patched jacket, a collarless shirt, and dark, heavy-looking trousers that were tied at the knees. He had a somewhat dishevelled appearance, with a rather unpleasant odour about him. Mrs. Davidson informed me that he doubled as an assistant gamekeeper on the Blessingfield Hall estate, where he lived alone in a tied cottage. Adams himself was light on conversation, but it was clear to me that he was fearful of Mrs. Davidson, as his sharp, weaselly eyes averted contact with hers, let alone the fact that she towered over him at 5 feet 10 inches. Having formally made our acquaintance, we returned to the school, where I met Miss Johnson, who was of a similar age and build to Mrs. Davidson. She was, in many respects, very much like her in attitude and temperament. Although cordially polite, it was clear that my presence was an unwelcome intrusion into school affairs. However, like Mrs. Davidson, she had to resign herself to suffering me for the while I remained at the school. Miss Johnson was more gaily dressed than Mrs. Davidson, wearing a light patterned blouse, an ankle-length blue skirt, and a very slight hint of makeup, but there it seemed the differences ended. I then, having made my arrangements for the school start on the following Monday, left the two women and cycled to Morton Abbey, where staff had prepared an evening meal and my room for me. The weekend passed uneventfully for me, as I spent most of my time in my room getting prepared for the week ahead. As requested by Mrs. Davidson, I reviewed the prepared syllabus and ensured that I was ready for whatever the week entailed. And in almost the blink of an eye, Monday morning arrived, and I found myself at the school for my first day, like a nervous scholar with a fearful trepidation. Following assembly in the church hall, where Mrs. Davidson formally introduced me after morning prayers, I followed the pupils out of the hall to the school. What struck me as truly unsettling was the children's demeanour as they entered their respective wings of the building. Rather than the usual cheerful chatter, laughter and vibrant energy that fills the air, there was an eerie stillness. They moved in pairs quietly and with downcast eyes, avoiding both conversation and smiles. It felt as though they were stepping into the gaping maw of a malevolent force which consumed their spirit as they passed beneath an ominous stone lintel above the entrance emblazoned with the words "boys" and "girls," and emphasized by pointers directing their path, which seemed to underscore a conformity on the very journey they were about to undertake. Stood on the entrance steps and dividing these ranks was the ominous presence of Mrs. Davidson, who with folded arms and a sternly dismissive face scowled from left to right as the lines of dipped heads passed her by. Even I trembled as I walked past her with the last of the boys into the classroom. Such was the power she wielded over her domain, and the rigid authority that her charges were forced to concede to. Once inside the room, I pulled the door shut by its well-worn brass handle, which was ingrained with the chalk and the grubby smears of little hands, and asked the children to take their seats. The room felt cluttered with religious prints lining the dusty walls, and a pall of oppression seemed to swallow up all who were within. After introducing myself, I felt that cold chill of obedience lift slightly as the atmosphere of my presence warmed the room. Throughout the teaching week, I gradually got to know the boys better, especially about their lives outside of school. One boy in particular, named Oliver Gunsby, the son of a local farm labourer, was reticent, speaking only to give his name as present during the morning roll call. For the rest of the day, he never spent time with the other boys, and always sat alone outside during playtime. And weirder perhaps, was that the other boys never bothered to speak with him, or indeed pay him any attention. He spent his school day attentively listening, but never wishing to speak, and never willing to interact. I did not press the boy nor draw attention to him in class, as I believed he appeared to be suffering a trauma of some kind, and proposed to take this up with Mrs. Davidson when I found the courage to do so. For me, this wasn't a seat of education, it was a prison of souls. On Friday, just after school, I was called to Mrs. Davidson's office. She apologised for not joining me in class due to her husband's ill health, and when I pressed her on his illness, she shrugged her shoulders and changed the subject. Obviously, I thought quietly, he must be suffering from a disease that, for the Victorian era sentiments of this woman, was something for which she was too embarrassed to discuss, so I decided not to press the subject. We briefly discussed my work in the classroom and whether I had encountered any issues with my charges. For that, I was thankful that I had not, and told her so. I decided it was best not to press on the Gunsby boy. She told me that for the following week she planned to visit my class to see how I was getting along with my charges, and with that wished me a pleasant weekend and dismissed me rather abruptly. When I returned to Morton Abbey, I took my evening meal in the staff dining room, which was adjacent to the kitchen. As one can imagine, this former medieval abbey property was a much extended country house and estate, complete with 20 full-time house staff and a retinue of 30 estate staff, covering every aspect of life here. Some staff lived in tied cottages with their families, whilst the remainder lived in quarters inside the abbey house and were afforded a separate staff dining room to eat, drink and socialise together as their life below stairs allowed. The staff were very hospitable towards me, and especially those whose charges were in my class at the school. I would receive frequent positive comments that their sons found me more pleasant than the sick Mr. Davidson, and they expressed a desire that he would never return. Of course, I could not comment on this for two reasons. Firstly, it is considered unprofessional, and secondly, as I did not know the man, I would not be in a position to comment. However, one staff member, a kitchen maid named Lizzie Morris, a slim auburn-haired young woman in her early 20s, who had finished her work in the kitchen, sat with me drinking a cup of tea and was very talkative. At first I thought she was entertaining me for some mail company, but instead she chatted about the school because her sister, Maggie, had a son and daughter attending it. Having settled herself down on the bench next to me, she, after introductions, said rather engagingly, "Do you know why Mr. Davidson is ill? Because I am sure you don't." I replied, "I have not been told, and his wife, the head mistress, isn't keen to discuss it either." She leaned in a little closer and whispered into my ear. "He's haunted," she breathed. "By what?" I asked, leaning in. "By a boy he drove to his death." The suggestion that the teacher I had deputized for had an apparent mental illness intrigued me, as it was pretty evident that a woman like his wife would fear social embarrassment from this. She explained with the minutest of detail. "Well, a year ago one of the boys, a 10-year-old, was found dead in the estate's lake. He had drowned, you know, and rumour has it he was driven to it by Davidson, who used to beat him with a cane in class for the most petty reasons. The boy was very clever, you know. He didn't mix much with the other boys, as he spent a lot of time reading and studying. On a couple of occasions he corrected Mr. Davidson in class when discussing history, and not out of malice mind. Still, Mr. Davidson took it personally because both times the rest of the class laughed out loud. Davidson couldn't take that." She stopped briefly before quickly taking a mouthful of amber liquid from her cup and continued. "He forced him to stand in the corner with his face to the wall. At the same time he whipped his backside so harshly with his cane that he cried all the way home." She paused to reflect with a sadness that drew from her moist eyes across her face. "When the poor lad got there, he had to hand his parents a note from Davidson, which claimed he was causing trouble in the class. The poor boy got a second beating from his father and was sent to bed without his evening meal. A few weeks later, he was given another whipping and a note by Mr. Davidson, and folks believed that rather than face his father for further beating, he walked into the lake and drowned." Shocked, I said, "This is terrible, really awful and difficult for me to believe." She lowered the tone in her voice and added, "Search the churchyard." Lizzie whispered, her eyes darting left and right. I swallowed. "Why would I—" "Just do it," she pressed, her voice low as a muffled whisper. "You'll understand once you see the boy is buried there." It struck me that she knew far more about this than she admitted, and she got up to leave. I thanked her for the chat and went to my room with some sandwiches. Having eaten them, I retired to bed with a curiosity that urged me to visit the churchyard the following morning. The church St. Martin's was previously the estate church to a Cistercian order that once occupied Morton Abbey. Unlike the abbey itself, which had been 90% demolished after 1540, the church survived and dated to the establishment of the abbey in 1150. Leaving history and my cycle aside, I entered through the lich gate and wandered inside down a stone-flagged path, where I saw, as detailed by Lizzie, the boy's grave, which had a bouquet of red roses on it. I could see that the burial was fairly recent, and so I raised the flowers to read his name. I was immediately mortified and dropped the bouquet when the child's name struck out in gold-painted lettering, Oliver Gunsby, who died aged 10 the previous year. I fell backwards in shock, almost choking to get my breath back. "How could this be?" I stammered, and saw Oliver himself staring at me from the lich gate in the previously empty churchyard. There were pleading tears in his eyes, and I felt a deep-seated demand for the justice he had been denied. As I rubbed my own eyes in disbelief, he had now disappeared. It was at this point that I was confused about what I should do in this matter. The appearances of Gunsby, both in the school and now here, demanded that I do something to address the wrongs caused to him by Davidson, but what specifically does he demand from me? As I had the day to myself, I cycled to the hamlet and left my bike at the school, where I proceeded to walk around the 2 streets that gave life to this bijou village. And it was then that I saw the boy again. This time he was drenched and soaking wet, and I saw him walk to the white front gate of a delightful thatched cottage, which had a small path leading to a porch entrance. The boy entered the garden path, and I by now stood only a few feet away, as I heard the boy's shoes squelch with water as he walked to the door. He stopped briefly and turned his face towards me. He was visibly angry and rapped the brass door knocker 3 times, where I saw the large frame of Mrs. Davidson answer the door. Her angry face turned to terror when she saw this grey-skinned, corpse-like intrusion in the form of Oliver, and she collapsed onto the doorstep as he passed through her body. There followed a loud, resonating scream from within as a large-bodied, middle-aged man dressed in a grey suit ran outside in wild panic and haphazardly tripped over Mrs. Davidson lying on the threshold as he fled in abject terror. He ran down the path onto the street, whereupon he seized me, fell to his knees, and looked back in terror as the ghost of Oliver Gunsby emerged onto the path with a venomous look in his dark eyes as he pointed accusingly with a long, withering finger. He grabbed my trousers and pleaded with me to save him, and I saw the stark terror marked in his red and sweaty face as he cried and screamed again as the boy drew closer and closer with the sound of his squelchy feet. Such was the speed of the events that I had no time to respond to him as he got back up and ran away down the street, still screaming. I saw no sign of Oliver, but I could hear the sound of his squelchy feet gathering apace behind him. He ran into a grassy track as his wild and crazy hair caught a breeze, and he disappeared from view on a trackway towards the Abbey estate. I followed on my cycle, pedalling as furiously as I could. My heartbeat raced in fear of what I was likely to find, and as the sun disappeared behind a thick veil of clouds, the ambience and atmosphere took on a depressing tone before me. I soon picked up on the dry mud a series of wet footprints which led me to the estate lake. There followed one final scream and a loud splash. By now I was hot and sweating as I dropped my cycle and ran to the water's edge. I saw Davidson being pulled from below into a watery grave, his hands seemingly clutching at the air. His body, dragged down, soon disappeared, leaving a mass of air bubbles that percolated to the surface before the quiet stillness of the lake had once more returned. I went to the Abbey, and with help from staff, I returned to the lake where, after some minutes, the body of Davidson was recovered. He was quite dead, although his face was stiff with the last gasp of life, leaving his mouth agape with open eyes staring into nothingness. Other staff members also went to the Davidsons' cottage to render assistance at my urging and to break the news of the discovery of his body to his wife. But death had visited her before they arrived, as a local doctor in attendance confirmed this. Police were later in attendance due to the strange circumstances surrounding their deaths. It was known that Davidson was suffering from mental trauma, and the doctor attending to both deaths was able to confirm that. However, what triggered his flight from home was not clearly understood, and I decided to say nothing other than the fact that I had called to discuss school issues at their home. Nobody other than myself saw a boy, or indeed any other person, and police and medical authorities accepted that Mr. Davidson had a mental illness which triggered his suicide by drowning in the lake. These findings were later accepted at the coroner's inquest, as was Mrs. Davidson's death, who had suffered a fatal heart attack. Doubtless, had I shared the real events surrounding their deaths, I am certain that I would have been consigned to a lunatic asylum. It was, however, suggested later by a reporter for a particular London newspaper that the Davidsons had a history of brutally punishing children in their charge, and that as many as 3 children may have died as a consequence through being driven to suicide. I later left the school at the end of my temporary contract with my reputation intact. I put these tragic events behind me and rose through my career to recently retire as headmaster of a famous boarding school. Even now, when a door creaks or I catch a whiff of pipe smoke, I am reminded of that wet footprint, and know Oliver Gunsby still stalks the tiny hamlet of Bacon's End. The End. The Bastion of Horror, written and read by Christopher Halton. I was angry. So we could have been the sacrificial goats if matters turned out differently. Dr. Hesse was, in his life, an evolutionary scientist in the field of genetics. After the end of World War II, he was recruited by His Majesty's government, where his work gained significant recognition in academic circles. He had published theoretical papers in The Lancet that were years ahead of his contemporaries. Although a German-born, Hesse lived in neutral Switzerland during the war, where he acquired great wealth through medical patents. From these assets, he built and established a laboratory, situated amid the bleakness of Dartmoor, which the Home Office protected. Security was very tight, and the grey blockhouse-like concrete property was ringed with double electrified fencing, rolled barbed wire, and patrols of ex-military servicemen guarding the interior and perimeter. Such was the secrecy of his work, which was restricted to a coterie of 5 scientists, all experts in the field of genetics. Everybody who worked there was under strict orders not to travel outside of the confines of the laboratory site unless authorized, and not to fraternize with locals. The entire site, spanning a few acres, occupied a prominent position above one of the highest tors in Dartmoor. Naturally, some resentment arose among the locals, who had previously used the site for hiking and picnics. Working with Hesse among the 5 were 2 former Nazi-era scientists who were headhunted at the end of the war by the British because of their medical and scientific expertise. The remaining 2 were of British and French origins. Visitors, understandably, were few and far between, except for a monthly delivery of food and supplies. Even the electricity supply was independent of the national electrical grid, having its hydroelectric power station fed by a nearby river and a reserve standby diesel-electric generator in the event of a breakdown. Nobody knew what was happening inside the Hesse compound, and rumours speculated that it was secret high-level government research work connected to the Cold War with Russia. And that was the state of things until the early 1950s when, well, to put it simply, some locals were reported missing to the police and none were found. In every case, the police would organise a search with walkers and locals of the surrounding countryside and across the hills, but no trace was ever found, save for a shepherd's crook found resting against a stone and next to a burnt-out fire. On that occasion it was a young man named Sam Smith, a local from nearby Chesfield, a small village situated low in a valley with a few arable fields and many trees that fringed and protected it from the fierce gales and storms that dominated this rocky landscape. In the event of these disappearances, police did not consider venturing to the compound as it was built and surveilled to keep out unwanted visitors, and any such intrusions were reported to police for investigation. From 1951 to 1954, the disappearances continued, and in total, 8 people from the village were reported missing either from their homes or further afield in the nearby moor, either on foot or from an abandoned motorcar. Each case was thoroughly investigated by the local police at the time, but due to the small county police force's limited resources and expertise, it lacked the necessary capabilities to search this somewhat wild and unforgiving landscape. Consequently, these missing reports remained open on file, which did not alleviate local unease regarding the matter. Some locals took it upon themselves to visit the compound, as they suspected a connection with the work being carried out there, which, to be fair, was more speculation on their part than fact. In every case, they were given short shrift by the guards who ushered them away. Still, fear and hostility were brewing among the 40 residents of Chesfield, and this concern attracted the attention of the Home Office, who decided to dispatch me, Detective Chief Inspector Michael Hazard, a Special Branch Officer of the Metropolitan Police, to review the reported cases and to visit the Hesse compound to carry out any inquiries. For many years I had worked as a detective on the Flying Squad, a specialist police department within the Metropolitan Police that focused on major crimes, and received numerous commendations for my commitment to duty. My transfer to Special Branch a few months earlier was a promotion from the rank of Detective Inspector. Another facet which added urgency was a hawk-like interest from the media, who had blown these disappearances into something akin to alien abductions, and the Home Secretary believed that a government response from the police could alleviate any fears or concerns the locals had in this matter, and that based on my inquiries, the findings of my report could be published in an edited form for the benefit of the general public. It had been arranged that I would take with me a detective sergeant and 4 detective constables from my department who would assist me with inquiries both on and off the compound. Despite Dr. Hesse's objections that this could compromise his work, it was agreed that none of us would be allowed access into his actual laboratory, and that at all times we would be accompanied on site by his staff. Having arrived in 2 unmarked cars and a van at the village, accommodation was found at the old coaching inn, the Greyhound, a large rambling stone building with a thatched roof, and a fairly friendly ruddy-faced landlord in the form of Isaac Coulthard, a powerfully built man in his mid-40s with a large bushy moustache and a smile to match, who lived at the inn with his wife Isabel and their 2 teenage daughters. As my men unpacked the vehicles, Coulthard stood, revelling in the influx of new customers. Upon seeing me, he excitedly shook my hand. He asked me to follow him inside to a beautiful old-world bar with heavy oak beams and a huge stone Bessemer fireplace, which had an attractive old coat of arms painted on a displayed ancient shield. In every sense and in every way, this building exuded old-world English charm, and I did not doubt that it had changed little from the 18th century. Noticing that I was looking at the shield, he chimed in, "That's the coat of arms for the Chesfield family, who used to live way up yonder in a castle near where the laboratory is." He added solemnly, "Sadly, it was made ruinous in the English Civil War, and the family died out 2 centuries ago. The shield is all that is left." I smiled and said, "Thanks for the history, and what a lovely place this inn is. We will probably be staying with you for a few weeks, and it will make a perfect base for operations, Mr. Coulthard." Almost blushingly he replied, "Thank you, sir. It is an honour to have you Scotland Yard boys here, and during your stay, if there is anything you need, let me know." Having chosen the best room in the house, a large Jacobean-style bedroom with a double oak-frame bed with wainscoting wall panels and an adjoining bathroom, I decided to use this as a hub for my operations, and for that purpose, a desk and lockable filing cabinet was brought with us in the van, and as such was placed in the room by 2 of my men. Here daily reports of inquiries would be brought to my room and filed. Also installed at the time by the GPO was a secure telephone line. Everything I needed was available and ideally suited to my needs. My men shared the 2 adjacent bedrooms, and the inn provided a full breakfast and evening meal for us all. Additionally, the coaching inn courtyard provided sufficient parking for our vehicles. Reports of these missing persons were provided to me by the local police, and the next day I dispatched the 4 detective constables to re-interview witnesses to try to establish any missing details, and importantly, whether they had any updates to report. In the meantime, I contacted the laboratory and spoke with Dr. Hesse's secretary, who was informed that we would be visiting the site within the next 2 days. So far, everything was in place, and with my colleague, Detective Sergeant Douglas Adams, an officer with 20 years' service, and like me, a time-served detective who had worked on the fraud squad. Adams, a man in his mid-40s, was tall and well-built, with a neat trim moustache and a strong military bearing. During the war, he served in the Guards Regiment and was highly decorated for bravery in action during the Italian campaign. He was very much a man's man and commanded much respect from his subordinates. We spent the day driving around the locality and letting any locals we came across know that the police were investigating these disappearances. However, I must say that this did not exactly allay any fears or apprehensions they may have had. They were convinced in some way that the disappearances were linked to the laboratory. We returned before dinner after a fairly uneventful day, where I arranged for us all to meet in my room to share and submit reports on the findings of their investigations. Having found some extra chairs from the inn, the officers from both pairs gave their findings, which, although not revealing any new information, did have one surprising addition. Detective Constable Stan Jones spoke to the father of a missing teenager, Alice Jenkinson, who disappeared 2 years ago, who claimed she was seen by a family friend, Jack Ogden, running across the moors one late evening last May in a heavy rainstorm. She was wearing only a blue one-piece dress and was screaming for help. Behind her, in the haze of the heavy rainstorm, were lights frantically flitting from side to side and growing larger before she and the lights disappeared from view. He, being a strongly religious man, viewed the entirety as something demonic. Although he reported back to the village within 10 minutes, no trace could be found by any subsequent search party, either at night or later during the following day. "Did you speak with Ogden?" I added. "Yes, Gov, we did, and he was convinced she looked like a living corpse. I can't add anything further other than the fact we did check out the locality of where she was seen, but there is nothing there that explains or adds weight to what Ogden is saying." I then spoke to the other pair of detectives. "Have you any fresh info or indeed just rumours to share?" Detective Constable Alan Moore stood up to report that although they had no new leads, the locals they spoke to were convinced that an unknown carnivorous creature was loose on the moor, as sheep were also disappearing. One sheep corpse was found half consumed and devoid of any blood some weeks earlier and in the same areas as the reported missing people. They also felt this creature was somehow connected to the laboratory, as before they moved to the district, nobody and no animal had gone missing from this tight-knit community. After thanking my men for their input, they, except for D.S. Adams, left the room to write their report logs. Turning to him, I said, "Well, Doug, what do you think? The talk of ghosts and monstrous carnivores on the moor suggests that these people have a vivid imagination. Although I have to concur that before Dr. Hesse arrived there were no reported missing people." "Yes, Gov, that's my position entirely. The secrecy employed at the laboratory does open one to suggestions of some malfeasance. Well," I added, "we'll call it a day, and tomorrow you and I will visit this Dr. Hesse. It'll be interesting to get his take on these matters." The following morning, after delegating the detective constables to review the other missing person reports, Doug drove me to the Hesse laboratory. When I arrived, I was somewhat shocked to view the sheer indomitable size and scale of the 20-foot walls and the double-lined electrical fencing. Notices bearing the royal cipher warned people to stay away, and they were further supplemented by signs warning of an electrical shock to anyone who touched the fence. In front of the entrance stood a red and white chevron-barred sentry box with a man dressed in a police-style uniform, complete with a blue tunic, trousers, shirt and tie, and complemented by a peaked hat, standing imperiously in front of a barrier and raising his palm to order us to halt. I then wound down the window alongside him, and the guard demanded to see my identification. I shared my warrant card and explained that we had an appointment with Dr. Hesse. He smartly stood to attention after viewing a clipboard in his possession, and he raised the barrier to drive forward to face a few yards further, a massive sliding steel door set into the walled concrete bastion that this laboratory appeared to be. Again we were confronted by another guard in a similar uniform, who, after verifying our credentials, let us in and directed us to park in a courtyard. My immediate thought was, what type of research goes on here that requires this level of security? Looking around the interior, it didn't have many visible structures within the bastion, It was mainly a large empty courtyard with these massive walls upon which stood other guards. The only visible structure was a small building with another steel sliding door that was our entrance to the laboratory. It seemed obvious that the complex was built underground. Having left our car locked and unattended, we followed another guard into this small structure, which transpired to be an elevator with 13 floors. Having pressed a button numbered 12, we quickly arrived on the floor where Dr. Hesse had his office and accommodation. Greeting us in a white laboratory coat was a 60-year-old man of short but heavy stature, with thick horn-rimmed glasses on a rather small round face. He smiled and shook my hand after saying in perfect English, "Good day, gentlemen. I am Dr. Hesse, the chief scientist and director of this facility. If you follow me, please." He then escorted us down a wide corridor to a brown-panelled door with the nameplate director's offices, which he opened and we entered. Inside we saw a rather plush office with thick heavy carpeting, a large brown mahogany desk, and apart from a captain-style chair behind it were two ordinary wooden chairs placed in front. He walked to the other side of the desk and sat down while sweeping his arm towards both chairs and said, "Please, gentlemen." We both sat down and formally identified ourselves and the reason for our visit. Dr. Hesse grinned and said, "I gather those villagers think I am responsible somehow for these disappearances, which is ridiculous." I said, "I appreciate that your research is kept under wraps, Doctor, but could you possibly outline to a limited degree what you are doing and why the secrecy?" He swiveled briefly in his chair and removed his glasses to clean them whilst appearing to be deep in thought. After a few seconds he put them back on. He again smiled to say, "Well, I am a geneticist, and in this laboratory we are looking at ways to use genetics to improve the lives of people suffering from birth disability, whether physically or mentally, and hopefully to improve the lot of the human race by eradicating disease." He paused briefly and continued, "Obviously I am not at liberty to share with you this research, as our enemies in the Soviet Union or China would weaponize my work to produce quite the opposite effect. And I cannot allow this to happen, which is why I am here in your country, working alongside your government." I said, "May I ask why you chose this site in the middle of Dartmoor?" "I wanted my laboratory below ground, and the sedimentary rock base here is stable enough to build the 13 floors for research. Although you may not have noticed, there are nearly 50 people, including security, who live and work here. In the event of a nuclear strike, we have enough supplies to maintain life here for 10 years. Doug Adams then interjected, "Sorry to interrupt you, sir, but if you are engaged in this research, what do you use as subject matter?" Dr. Hesse frowned and leaned forward towards Doug to say, "Well, Sergeant, we are not experimenting on humans if that is what you are implying. I chose to live in neutral Switzerland during the war, as I was strongly opposed to the Nazis' clinical research on Jews and Russians." He then stood to his feet and ushered us back into the corridor where, to be honest, I thought he was going to show us the door. Instead, he took us to another room which was filled with animal cages containing laboratory rats, dogs, cats, mice and monkeys. "Here, gentlemen, is our subject material. I appreciate you have a job to do and understand the reasoning behind your questions, but we do not use humans or have had contact with any person outside this facility, especially those reported missing from that village." Doug apologized and said, "Thank you, sir, for appreciating why we are here, but what we cannot understand is why so many people have gone missing, and especially after your team came here." He waved both his hands down as if to calm a non-existent outburst of emotions and said, "I paid to build here from my funds because I believe in a better future for humanity. Your government are now on board with me and supports my work financially. In return, they inspect my laboratory regularly and I supply them with research updates. I can say that we are looking at improving sources of animal protein, and in that regard, our biological research is very much focused. That is all I can really add. I am sure you'll understand the need for keeping our cards close to our chests." As we were about to leave, red warning lights fitted to the walls began to flash. and another laboratory-coated man, tall and slim with short, trimmed brown hair, entered the room and whispered in Dr. Hesse's ear. Looking very concerned, Dr. Hesse said, "I'm afraid you will have to leave the facility as there is a drill in progress. My colleague, Dr. Hawkson, will escort you back out. If you need to come back at another time, please feel free to do so, gentlemen." He then disappeared into the corridor while Dr. Hawkson, the only Englishman on the team, escorted us to the elevator, which quickly returned us to the compound above. As we were travelling up, Dr. Hawkson attempted to make light conversation, but like Hesse, he appeared to have something on his mind. We were then escorted by a guard back to the car, and we left. As we were driving back to the village, we discussed our meeting with Dr. Hesse and his facility, and the so-called drill reported at the end. We both felt that Hesse and his team were covering up something quite serious that they were prepared to keep secret, but at least superficially his raison d'etre seemed legitimate and above board. We also discussed the report of the missing teenager, Alice Jenkinson, who was seen running for her life. It did not seem far-fetched to suggest that the lights behind her were nothing more than flashlights, and that there were people in pursuit of her. Doug suggested that perhaps they were conducting research on people, and that this girl was attempting to escape when she was seen. To this end, we decided to speak with the inn's owner, Isaac Coulthard, who seemed to be knowledgeable about the area's history and geography. We arrived back around lunchtime, and after consuming a meal prepared by Isaac's wife, we invited him to sit with us at a table in the bar. Like most folk when asked to speak with the police, he appeared a little concerned, but smiled with a forced bravado. "How can I help you, gentlemen?" he said nervously. I smiled at him. "No need to worry, Isaac. Sorry if you don't mind me being informal." He nodded and smiled. "Well, you mentioned to me the history of the Chesfield family and the now long-gone castle. Are there any ruins as such left?" He replied, "Just a few base walls, sir, nothing more. The vaulted medieval cellars are long gone, but the bases of the walls can be inspected, sir." He then loaned me a local map showing where the castle ruins were, and only half a mile from the laboratory. "Are you and your boys planning to have a picnic there, sir?" he inquired jokingly. I replied, "No, I just wanted to check out the topography of the area, and I noticed that the ruins are not far from where the Jenkinson girl was seen. Interesting." Thanking him for his assistance, we waited in my room for my men to return, which they duly did late in the afternoon. None of them had much to report, but we shared our findings at the laboratory, and we all agreed the operation there seemed suspicious. We also decided to travel over to the castle ruins in the early morning of the following day to search the site for any possible openings in the ground which may have explained the presence of the girl. For this purpose, I ordered the men to dress informally and to bring any tools, ropes, lights or other items in the event of such a discovery. With that, all were dismissed for the day while I made a telephone call to my boss, Detective Chief Superintendent Hartley at Scotland Yard. The purpose of the call was to discuss my visit to Hesse, and he agreed that there was a possibility that Hesse wasn't being entirely open and honest. However, as this matter involved the Home Office, we would focus more on the mystery of the missing people. I agreed and informed him that we were planning to conduct a more detailed sweep of the area the following day, and I would report accordingly. At 9 a.m. the following morning, the 5 of us drove up to near the site of the old castle. Leaving our vehicle parked just off the roadside, we surveyed the rocky landscape and agreed it was going to be a rather tricky place to search. However, I instructed them to report any irregularities they discovered on site to me immediately. Like the outspread fingers of the hand, we spread out our search across the castle site, very slowly but meticulously. It was a bright, warm day, and the light helped cast shadows that delineated areas not immediately observable to the human eye. After an hour, we were about to call it a day when Stan Jones cried out in the distance, "Over here, Gov!" He was bending over a rock and pointed his hand towards it in a rather excited manner. I blew my police whistle, which was a signal to stop. I instructed everyone to meet with Stan, who I must say was an extremely diligent young officer and in later years retired as a police superintendent. Anyway, to cut to the chase, we gathered around Stan, and I asked him to share his observations. Pointing at a crevice next to this large flat rock, he said, "If you look closely at the gravel, it looks like the rock has been swiveled around. You can see the striations it has left there." His observation was impeccable. He saw the marks initially as faint shadows from the sun, and it was clear that someone had moved that stone. Gathering ropes and hooks from the boot of the car, we tied them to the rock in a fashion which would allow us to pull and rotate the stone. After some effort, we heard a loud click, as though something had been broken, and the stone easily swiveled around. As we discovered later, it was rotating on a hidden metal rod, which acted as a giant hinge. Beneath the gaping hole, which was circular and 3 feet in circumference, we could see the top of a metal ladder leading into darkness. I elected to enter first, and with a rope tied to my waist, I clambered down with a flashlight into a huge cavernous room which appeared to be part of the undercroft of the lost castle. Around me I could see medieval carved pillars supporting a stone roof, and in the distance a tunnel, which appeared to date to the same period as the undercroft. In one corner I found a box of ready-charged flashlights, which seemed to have been left recently, as no dust had gathered on the box. I called quietly to the rest of my men to join me, and they were as much in awe and shocked as I was. This discovery seemed to explain the sighting of the missing girl, but where did the tunnel lead to? I ordered that firstly we push back the stone to cover the hole, and from within it was easier to do so through some mechanical gears and a lever. With the flashlights we found, and those already in our possession, we entered the tunnel, which, if my sense of direction was correct, led in the direction of the laboratory site. About 10 minutes into the roughly hewn rock tunnel, Doug heard something and told us to stand and keep quiet. It was a slopping sound that was discerned at first faintly in the darkness of the tunnel. We crept forward, shielding our flashlights so that they shone barely enough light onto the ground. The slopping sound grew louder and was accompanied by the sound of something wet sliding, and then a low, gargling, growling sound, as whatever this was had heard us. At the same time, water was dripping quite fast from the tunnel roof, and the ground was slippery and challenging to walk on. A couple of times we all slipped and fell to discover a mucus-like substance on our hands and clothing. It seemed apparent to me that there was some creature abounding in the tunnel, and I was certain it wasn't any creature known to mainstream science. The growling was weird. It, like the other sounds, appeared a wet sucking noise, and we decided at that point to return back to where we started to get assistance and weapons to be safe. Whatever this was may be the reason so many had disappeared. I left 2 men posted at the entrance and returned to the inn, where I contacted my superior and explained in detail our findings. Whatever it was, it sounded like no creature known to science and may be responsible for the disappearances. He agreed not to contact the laboratory. Instead, he contacted the Home Secretary directly, who authorized the use of firearms. To this end, additional officers who were permitted to carry firearms arrived in 3 vans 2 hours later, carrying enough Smith & Wesson .38 handguns to issue to every man present. In total, there were 20 of us, with 5 being plainclothes and the others in uniform. Due to the rather wet and slippery nature of the tunnel, each man was issued a boiler suit and a mining helmet equipped with its own light. Additional armed support remained in the area in case assistance was needed, and a temporary base for wireless communications was established. We were also given a cover story that we were seeking a dangerous criminal from Dartmoor Prison, and we advised the laboratory, villagers and hill farmers to be on their guard and remain where they were. By 7 p.m. that day, we were prepared to go in with the tactical officers leading the way. For the first 15 minutes, there was silence in the tunnel with no weird or adverse sounds heard. As we advanced further, the walls and roof of the tunnel glistened with dripping water, And other than these sounds, there was silence until the tunnel started to rise slightly, as though we entered a gradient. It was then, and only then, that we were caught off guard. From the light in my hand and the light on my helmet, 5 men in front were swallowed up by something I would describe as a black, slimy, sinuous lump as it dropped from the roof. Before us we could see the trapped outlines of the men's bodies as they were lying prostrate on the ground, and they quickly disappeared or were absorbed by this thing as it sucked and slurped on their bodies. There was silence, complete silence, as this thing made their body shapes disappear. We fired our revolvers, hitting this thing with a multitude of bullets until our chambers were spent, but this thing seemingly grew bigger as it rose in the air, followed by a filthy stench, an acrid evil smell of death. It then slopped its body on the ground and absorbed 2 more men, and at that point I knew we were done for. But then a powerful light appeared from behind this creature, and then the fire from 2 flamethrowers, which caused it to writhe and scream in the most hideous sound I have ever heard. As the flames shot into its slimy, shapeless body, the covering or skin of it bubbled and burst, releasing a grey mucus blister that spluttered its filth onto the floor. It went silent as it burned, and the acrid smoke forced us to retreat briefly. As the smoke cleared, the flamethrowers stopped shooting spouts of fire, and we heard the voice of Dr. Hesse, who shouted, "You may come through now, it is destroyed." Together with the survivors, which thankfully included all my men, we joined Hesse and his men as he led us from his end of the tunnel into the laboratory complex. Leaving my men and the other officers at the canteen area in the first level, I accompanied him to his office. Hesse, who was wearing a flame-resistant suit, said, "Okay, Chief Inspector, this creature was a biological mishap resulting from an experiment to create a hybrid between a cyphozoa and a gastropod, which would provide a fast-growing protein that, when dried, could be made into food pellets for distribution to third-world countries suffering from starvation. The protein also carried an enzyme which, when absorbed into the body, would give instant immunization from a variety of diseases, and as such could feed and save the world." "Okay, Doctor, it all sounded laudable, so what on earth went wrong?" "This creature should never have been created. It was an abomination of science, with an intelligence matched to a predatory streak that it used to attack and consume prey when it escaped onto the moors," he added. "What brought this chimeric organism together was an alien bacterium I discovered in Switzerland. It displayed many properties which allowed it to adapt to any environment." He continued, "Apart from sheep, it also consumed those individuals who were missing, and we were tracking it to destroy it. But it was difficult to capture because it could adapt and camouflage itself in any environment." "And was that alarm the day of my visit a warning that their creature was active?" "The red alert you experienced was when it attempted to re-enter the compound via our emergency escape tunnel. But being smarter and more adept, it escaped again. The Home Office was fully aware of the situation, but they hoped that by getting you and your men involved, they could bring official closure." I was angry. So we could have been the sacrificial goats if matters turned out differently. Hesse apologized profusely, but as he explained that in science there are always risks, but this risk became a threat and a challenge. But one matter could never be explained. Was that the actual ghost of the missing teenager, Alice Jenkinson, seen on the moors? However, Hesse's laboratory was closed down shortly afterwards, and Hesse and his research were transferred to the government research facility at Porton Down, where he later disappeared under unusual circumstances. The end.